The moment Zorian realized that there was a fist flying towards him, he instinctively tried to take a step back to avoid it. Unfortunately, his and Kiriel's luggage was right behind him and he was never really a hand-to-hand fighter to begin with. Surprised and imbalanced as he was, Zack's punch not only connected with his face but also sent him sprawling to the ground, the back of his head slamming painfully against the unyielding concrete. He didn't black out, but the force of the impact still left him in a confused daze for some time. It couldn't have been very long, just a couple of seconds, but when he regained the ability to process what his senses were telling him, he found that his surroundings had absolutely exploded in the brief period of time he was incapacitated. Kiriel was screaming for help at the top of her voice, and she could scream really, really loudly when she wanted to, while simultaneously kicking and clawing at Zack like a cornered lynx. Zack, for his part, looked very confused and panicked, awkwardly trying to fend off Kiriel's attacks without hurting her while trying to explain himself. Sadly for him, his words were largely unintelligible due to Kiriel's shrill and incessant shouting. The boy seemed to be at a total loss as to how he should deal with the situation he found himself in. He shouted for Kiriel to stop and calm down, and was a little surprised when she immediately stopped attacking and retreated behind him. Considering how fiercely she had defended him, he sort of expected her to be harder to restrain. But no, apparently now that he was back on his feet, it was his own responsibility to defend them both. Fair enough. Logically speaking, he was better qualified to stand up to Zack than a 9-year-old girl. Logic could be misleading, though he doubted he could ever put Zack on the defensive as much as Kiriel had a few moments ago. It was a good thing that Zack didn't look like he wanted to continue attacking him anytime soon. Kiriel poked her head from behind Zorian to give Zack one final glare, causing him to flinch slightly, before turning to Zorian and giving him a questioning look. No doubt she wanted to know why this total stranger just punched him in the face out of nowhere. It was a good question. Why did Zack just do that? Hell, if Zorian knew. He had considered the possibility that Zack might be hostile to him when they finally met, yes, but this wasn't really what he had in mind when he thought of a hostile Zack. Punching him in the face was hostile, yes, but physically attacking your target in a crowded train station was not a proper way to ambush a fellow time traveler. Even Zack should know this. So what was this about, really? Sighing heavily, Zorian ran his hand through his hair in frustration and gave Zack a good hard look. Two things immediately jumped out to him. First of all, he couldn't sense anything from Zack. As far as his empathy and mind sense were concerned, the boy in front of him did not exist. He had no thoughts or emotions at all. That meant that the Zack in front of him was either a very good illusion or under the effect of the mind-blank spell. Considering his punch felt quite real, he was going to assume it was the latter. Evidently Zack had come to this meeting a lot better prepared than he had been in the past. Secondly, he should probably get Kiriel's nails clipped after they got to Amaya's place, because they were evidently long enough to draw blood if she used them to scratch people. Zack had received a pretty nasty-looking wound on his forearm during his brief battle with her. As he noted before, Zack didn't seem interested in fighting with him anymore. The boy looked back at him with a strained smile and greeted him with a quick, awkward wave of his hand. Ugh, Zorian thought to himself unhappily. This guy. This, Zorian announced out loud, is all one giant misunderstanding. Yes. Zack immediately agreed, nodding frantically. Totally a misunderstanding. Of course, it couldn't really be that simple. Zack and Zorian spent the next 15 minutes explaining to Kiriel that they were classmates who knew each other from before and that this was just Zack making good on his promise to punch Zorian in the face the next time he saw him for being a big jerk. Or so Zack claimed, anyway. Zorian could hardly believe what he was hearing. That was serious. He had to admit he did vaguely remember Zack promising something along those lines in that awful Soul Kill restart when they had last seen each other, but he hadn't thought much of it. People make proclamations like that all the time. Zorian had totally forgotten about it until Zack reminded him about it. In any case, after they were done explaining things to Kiriel, they had to explain things again to the policeman that had come to check up on the disturbance. Since Zorian had stood up in Zack's defense, they decided not to arrest him, so instead they issued a monetary fine to both of them for fighting in public. Zorian personally thought that was totally bullshit, but since Zack immediately promised he would pay both of their fines out of his own pocket, he decided not to protest too much. Then it was time for a third round of explanation. Since Zack's attack on Zorian took place so soon after their arrival in Syoria, Fortov was still around and decided to check up on this disturbance happening nearby. It was pretty bizarre seeing Fortov actually concerned for his and Curiel's well-being for once in his life, but the concern did not last very long. Once Fortov realized they were both fine and that Zorian's attacker was his friend, he quickly left them alone to go back to his friends. Not that Zorian was complaining, of course, the less time he had to spend around Fortov, the better. Still, this was the first time since forever that Fortov had sought him without intending to get a favor. He even managed to restrain himself from insulting Zorian in the course of talking to him. It was novel, and therefore interesting. Well then, Zorian clapped his hands. Now that that's done, we should get going. Our new landlord is waiting for us, and I want to get somewhere where people aren't staring at us and talking behind our backs. Is he going to come with us? Curiel asked, giving Zack a suspicious look. Yes, Zack confirmed. He had largely recovered from Curiel's attack by now, regaining most of his usual confidence. I need to talk to your brother about some things. What kind of things? Curiel demanded. Serious things, Zack said. She looked to Zorian for confirmation and harumphed dismissively when he nodded in agreement to this. You're both stupid, she pouted. Acting like that in public, and I was actually scared we were under attack and everything. Don't be like that, Zorian told her, using one of his arms to draw her into a one-armed hug. I was really touched by your defense of me, you know. I'm pretty sure this was the first time someone stood up for me like that since, well, ever. She's too much, Zack said, studying the 3 bloody lines Curiel had scratched into his forearm. So I'll tell you what, see if you show some patience with Zack today, I'll answer any question you may have about the whole thing later in the evening before we go to sleep, Zorian told her, ignoring Zack's whining. Really? Curiel asked, peering at him suspiciously. Really, Zorian confirmed. While Zorian didn't usually tell Curiel that he was a time traveler, he wasn't violently opposed to the idea. Since it seemed he was going to interact with Zack pretty heavily in this restart, he didn't see much harm in telling her what was really going on. He was pretty sure Red Robe would sooner track him down by monitoring Zack's movements than by following a chain of distorted rumors back to Curiel. Really? Zack asked, looking at him curiously. Yes, really. Zorian huffed. What's with all this disbelief? It's almost as if they didn't expect him to tell the truth or something. I already told her about the restarts before, and it wasn't a problem. You did? Curiel frowned. But I don't remember you telling me anything about any restarts. Completely understandable, Zorian said, patting her on the head. Don't worry, all will become clear later. He hoped. He glanced at Zack again, wondering why the boy tracked him down now, of all times, after spending so many restarts avoiding Syoria. He really did hope Zack's arrival would make things clearer instead of just complicating things further. Zorian had originally intended for this restart to be much like the previous ones, but with the sudden inclusion of Zack into his schedule, he decided that plan was untenable and would have to change. Accordingly, he did not bother meeting Nachka this time around, instead taking Curiel and Zack straight to Amaya's place. Curiel had a tendency to blab just about anything to Nachka, who was not exactly very good at keeping secrets herself, and that didn't mesh too well with his intention to tell Curiel about the time loop in this restart. The first half of the journey was uncomfortably subdued. Well, Zorian himself didn't mind the peace and quiet all that much, but he knew that neither Curiel nor Zack were predisposed to be that silent for long periods of time. The two did not know how they should act in the presence of the other and thus kept to themselves. That lasted up until it started raining. At that point Kyrielle decided she wanted to play around with the rain barrier Zorian set up around them, just like she usually did at the start of the restart, Zach's presence be damned. That turned out to have been the icebreaker, and they both got more talkative all of a sudden. Both towards Zorian and to each other. Of course, he and Zach could not really discuss the time loop out in the open. With Kyrielle around, so their conversation mostly took place in the form of discussing their magical skills and occasionally demonstrating a spell or two to Kyrielle and each other. Aside from being a useful conversational tool, it also allowed the two of them to compare their abilities against one another to see where they stood in regards to magical ability. Well, somewhat obviously Zorian wasn't laying bare his entire skill set to Zach's scrutiny, and he doubted the other time traveler was being perfectly forthright either, but still. Just because the comparison wasn't complete did not mean it was worthless. What Zorian discovered was humbling. While Zach was very combat magic focused, just like the boy had admitted to him in the past, he had made good use of the time loop to turn himself into a well-rounded mage. He was the sort of archmage that made other archmages envious. He had expertise in just about every type of magic, including the notoriously difficult and specialized medical spells. He actually healed the scratch marks Kyrielle gave him as a proof of that claim. Even in regards to crafting-oriented magics like alchemy and spell formula, which Zach admitted were his least favorite fields and which Zorian specialized in, the last Novita still possessed sufficient expertise to debate Zorian in a non-vacuous manner. Finally, the little demonstrations they did for Kyrielle clearly showed that Zach's shaping skills weren't any worse than Zorian's. Despite having huge mana reserves, Zach had excellent shaping skills. Whatever Zorian could say about Zach's choices in the time loop, he clearly hadn't been standing idle this whole time. He had been steadily working on his skills for decades, and it showed. In retrospect, it was horribly arrogant of Zorian to even think he could have caught up to the guy in little more than 5 years. You know, I can't help but notice that your older brother left pretty quickly and didn't even try to talk to me, Zach said. Not that I'm complaining, since it works out better for me that way, but you'd think he'd be more interested in someone attacking his little brother in public. He knows that neither of us can stand him, so he keeps away, Kyrielle said casually, doing her best to snatch the little animated water drakes flying around her out of the air. Zorian and Zach had competed earlier to see who can create more realistic-looking drakes out of the surrounding rainwater, so the entire shield bubble was still full of them. Zorian was pretty sure he won, but Kyrielle was the judge and she claimed she couldn't tell the difference. The little traitor. I don't think he's that considerate, Zorian scowled. He just didn't feel like spending time on us. He had better things to do than waste time on his younger siblings. No, I'm pretty sure he knows you hate him, Kyrielle said, shaking her head. He even said so when we were alone once. It's why he tries to avoid you if he can help it. He thinks he's doing you a favor. Zorian frowned. He supposed he hadn't been terribly subtle about his opinion about Fortov, so he wasn't really surprised that Fortov knew. He did find it hard to accept that Fortov's behavior was motivated by anything other than his selfishness, though. If he wanted to do Zorian a favor, why was it that he still came to Zorian from time to time to ask for favors? That was the worst reason possible for approaching him. The whole reason why he hated Fortov was because he always had to make up for Fortov's failures to do his job in addition to his own duties. So you think I'm being too harsh with him? Zorian asked curiously. Before he had gotten stuck in the time loop, the mere insinuation that this was the case would have been the equivalent of throwing a lit match in a bowl of lamp fuel. Now he found himself honestly curious about what Kyrielle thought about the topic. No. Yes. Maybe, Kyrielle said. I mean, he's still a jerk and I don't like him either. So I know how you feel. But maybe us being mean to him back isn't the correct thing to do. Maybe he'd be better if we were more patient with him. I'm not. I try being nice to him sometimes, but he makes it very hard. Yeah, I'll bet, Zorian snorted derisively. You know, I'm getting the idea that your family is a little messed up, Zack said. You have no idea, Zorian said. And that's probably a good idea. Let's end the subject here, okay? Fine, fine, Zack acquiesced. So, is this the place? Zorian looked at the house Zack was pointing out and nodded. That's Amaya's house, yes. Let me just arrange for everything with the landlord and unpack a little and then we can talk. Do you have a place already lined up? I didn't think that far, Zack admitted. Zorian sighed. Figures. Then we'll go to the ruins of the Iranian colony in the tunnels below us. There is already a pretty good warding scheme protecting the place. Oh, so you know where that is? Zack said, perking up. Did any of the spiders survive? Spiders? Kiriel mumbled, brows furrowed in thought. Zorian could tell she had been analyzing their every word during the entire walk, trying to figure out what they were hiding. It was both commendable and amusing. No, none, Zorian shook his head. Zack immediately deflated. So it's just the two of us, or, he asked hopefully. Though his empathy could pick nothing from him, Zack wasn't a terribly hard person to read. Zorian realized that Zack really wanted to talk to fellow time travelers. The more of them there were, the better. He must have been very lonely and bored all these years he spent in the time loop. Just let me drop off Kiriel at the house and then we'll talk, Zorian said. You better not forget your promise, Kiriel warned, jabbing him in the ribs with her bony little index finger. Yeah, she was definitely getting her nails clipped when he got back. Fine, said Zack. I'll wait for you to dash. Oh no, Zorian said, cutting him off. Do you know what Amaya would do to me if she heard I left a person out here in the rain instead of inviting them inside? And she'd definitely hear, because Kiriel is too much of a tattletale to keep her mouth shut. Hey, said Tattletale protested. She won't care that you're a mage and can easily protect yourself against the rain. I'd be hearing lectures and snide comments for days, Zorian said. You're coming inside and introducing yourself to Amaya. And so, with Kiriel and Zack in tow, Zorian walked up to Amaya's door and knocked. After an hour or so, once everything had been arranged, Zorian led Zack into the depths of Sayoria's underworld. Along the way, Zorian explained the truth behind what happened to Zack. There had been no large number of time travelers, just him and the Iranians piggybacking on him using memory packets. And in the aftermath of their confrontation with Red Robe, the Irania were all dead soul-killed, according to Red Robe. While Zorian had some doubts about that, it was undeniable that the Irania started every loop dead from that point on. Once they had reached the dead Iranian settlements and Zack had had the chance to study the place for a while, they sat down and began to talk. I tried to find this place immediately after that restart, Zack noted, staring at the nearby Iranian corpse. He was surprisingly shaken by the dead settlement, considering Irania were rather inhuman and he had known them for a very short time anyway. All I found were some isolated Iranian corpses like this one. Those were basically guard posts, explained Zorian. Yeah, I guess. Maybe I'd have tracked it down eventually, but then this Red Robe tried to ambush me. Zorian perked up. This was the first clue he had about Red Robe's activities in the wake of Zorian's confrontation with him. He attacked you? Zorian asked, leaning forward with interest. Attacked me and lost, Zack grinned proudly. He's not that hard to beat without Quadakickle to support him. So Zack was good enough to defeat Red Robe in a straight one-on-one fight. That was good to know. I guess he was counting on the advantage of surprise, but I saw his ambush from a mile away, Zack continued. I knew he was probably stalking me, so I was already on guard. Still. He managed to escape in the end, and I didn't really feel safe wandering around these tunnels with someone like that hunting me. I basically left Sayoria and hid for the rest of the restart. Did he ever come after you again? Zorian asked. Yes. Once, Zack said. In the very next restart, he tried to attack me at its very beginning. He teleported straight through the wards on my home and tried to kill me while I was still in the bedroom, getting dressed. And he once again fled when you defeated him? Zorian asked. Well, I'm actually the one that fled there, Zack said, coughing uncomfortably. I was still half asleep and in my underwear, okay? I didn't expect him to come after me so early. Anyway, from that point on I have been leaving Scioria at the start of every restart to prevent further surprises like that. Even if Red Robe never came after me again after that one surprise attack. Zorian hummed thoughtfully. He doubted that Red Robe spent all this time trying to track down Zack, so this still did not explain why he had been quiet all this time, but it was interesting information nonetheless. What did Red Robe want from Zack so badly? So why did you stop hiding now, of all times? And did you really have to punch me in the face like that? Zorian asked sourly. My teeth still hurt from that. Do you even have to ask? Zack scoffed. You have been stuck in this time loop along with me for gods know how long, and you never came to me about it. No, worse than that, when I came to talk to you, you played dumb and did things on your own behind my back. You deserved a good punch in the face just for that. Zorian fiddled with his glasses awkwardly. Okay, it did sound kind of bad when he said it like that. But he had good reason for behaving like he did. He really did. You're sure he's not doing it right now, right? Zorian cut in with a question. I know how to shield myself from tracking magic, Zorian, Zack said frostily. Better than you, I imagine. It's just that I usually didn't bother with it, since I thought I was the only person aware of the time loop, so why bother? Ever since that night, though, I've been layering non-detection spells on myself constantly. The asshole hasn't managed to track me down once in all this time. I doubt anyone can. I can, Zorian noted. But then again, I seem to have an advantage that Red Robe does not seem to possess. I'll trust that you know how to protect yourself. Zack gave him an unreadable look. Almost without thinking, he tried to focus his empathy on the boy to get a better feel for his emotions, only to suddenly remember that Zack was under the effect of mind blank when he felt nothing at all from the boy. Yes, Zack could definitely protect himself if he wanted to. You'll tell me about that later, Zack said, shaking his head. Anyway, sorry for snapping at you. I'm still kind of angry at myself for getting screwed over by Red Robe. I get a little testy about the subject. But anyway, I understand. It was dangerous to just talk to me directly with Red Robe lurking in the background. I still think you should have talked to me, but I can see why you'd think otherwise. I can even understand why you left that night without bothering to explain anything to me, considering what ended up happening. Zack gestured towards a nearby Iranian corpse for emphasis. So I decided to leave you alone for a while. Even once it became obvious that Red Robe was no longer after me, and had essentially disappeared into thin air as far as I could tell, I stayed away so as to not attract attention to you. Just in case Red Robe was somehow watching, despite all my precautions. I figured you knew what you're doing, and once you were ready, you'd come to me so we could tackle the time loop and this Red Robe guy together. How did he expect Zorian to track him down if he purposely made himself as untraceable as possible? Never mind, he'd ask that question some other time. Best not to interrupt the boy now. And then you pull that crap in the last restart, said Zack, anger leaking into his voice. You're finally making a move, and in a big way too, triggering the invasion several weeks early, but you made no attempt to involve me in any way. How can I not be angry? How can I not want to punch you in the face? Do you think so little of me? Just because you saw me brought down by two incredibly powerful opponents, one of which is a 1,000-year-old lich, you think you can dash? Zack, listen, that wasn't intentional. Zorian said hurriedly, trying to stop Zack from getting too angry. He had a feeling he was going to get another punch in the face if he let the boy get going too much. I never intended that restart to blow up like that. The whole thing was a mistake, it escalated way beyond what I was comfortable with, but I was curious and... Did you even intend to contact me? Ever? Zack asked him bluntly. Yes. Absolutely, Zorian confirmed. Probably after this very restart. Zack leaned back in surprise, giving him a surprised look. Oh, he said, anger draining right out of him. Well, if that's so, then it's probably good I came to you when I did, isn't it? I'm kind of in the middle of something important, Zorian sighed. I really should be focusing on that. Hell, I should have been focusing on it in the previous restart too, instead of messing around with Ayaska Mansion and the invaders, but I can get really stupid sometimes. That's why I only wanted to contact you after this restart. If it's so important, why not let me help? Zack asked curiously. It's not something you can help me with, said Zorian. Remember those memory packets the Arania used to retain awareness between restarts? Well, here's the thing. He then launched into an explanation about the Matriarch's memory packet and how he had been trying to hone his Arania memory interpreting skills to a high enough level to understand its contents. This also led to a discussion about Zorian's mind magic abilities. Zack was clearly uncomfortable with mind magic, which made sense considering how it was used against him. After some internal debate, Zorian offered to have a look inside Zack's mind to see what exactly Red Robe had done to him, but Zack predictably refused. He admitted that he didn't really trust Zorian that far yet, and maybe never would. Zorian was just glad the other boy didn't take offense at his offer. So if I understand you correctly, you're attacking isolated Iranian patrols in order to practice memory reading skills on subdued Arania, Zack said. Yes, Zorian confirmed. And you think I can't help you there? Zack asked incredulously. Zorian, you're a total idiot. Zorian fumbled, not sure how to respond to that. Zorian, with my help you would not need to waste time stalking isolated patrols. We could just walk up to the main Iranian settlement and take them all head-on, Zack told him. I've done that before. I didn't just spend all these past months keeping out of Red Robe's sight, I've also been investigating things on my own, such as searching for other Iranian webs around the continent to see if they can help me. Except that I'm not psychic like you and they can be incredibly dismissive and rude to flickerminds like myself. I've been attacked plenty of times, and I know exactly how to fight them. They're no match for me at all. The power disparity is so big I can actually focus on incapacitating them instead of aiming to kill even when they attack in groups. With my help, you could have had hundreds of Iranian practice dummies every week, maybe every day. It largely depends on how fast we can find new webs to target. Zorian stared at Zack for a few seconds before swallowing heavily. That was a good point. He hadn't even considered that. Well, what's done is done, Zack shrugged. But I'm here now, so you have no excuse to keep being stupid. When do we start? In the end, Zorian decided there was no reason to delay things, they would be going after their first web the very next day. In the meantime, he went back to Amaya's place and talked to Kiriel. She claimed to believe him when he said he was a time traveler, but Zorian could sense she wasn't entirely convinced yet. Even after he recreated a stack of her drawings from his mental storage and showed them to her. Though that part did seem to make his story a lot more plausible to her. I'm relieved, she told him before going to bed for the night. You were so nice to me, it was really scary. I was afraid you were replaced by some kind of shape changer. Go to sleep, Kiri, Zorian sighed. The next day Zorian located one of the smaller webs in the vicinity of Scioria and took Zack there. He wasn't entirely convinced the operation would go as smoothly as Zack had promised, but Zack soon made all his fears groundless. The Iranian web in front of them was subdued with terrifying ease. There were no fancy tactics involved. Zack simply walked up to the settlement's main entrance tunnel and started raining down spells on the ill-prepared defenders. Waves of translucent blue force battered them against the walls, animated serpents made out of lightning electrocuted them and grasping ectoplasmic threads entangled them and stopped them from simply fleeing. When they realized that Zack was immune to mind magic, the Arania turned to traps, ambushes, and mass attacks, but Zack simply punched through them, barely slowed at all. Magical traps were dispelled, non-magical traps disabled with alteration spells, the mass attacks and ambushes Zack simply tackled head-on and won anyway. In less than half an hour, every Arania that did not flee was incapacitated or dead. Aside from actually locating the web, Zorian hadn't done much and had just stood back and watched the carnage. Zack was absolutely terrifying. "Do you think this will be enough for you to work with?" Zack asked, rocking back and forth on the balls of his feet and giving him an expectant look. Zorian gave him an annoyed look. He could sense at least 50 Iranian minds around them. The asshole knew well enough that this was more than Zorian could have subdued in an entire week of non-stop attacks on Iranian patrols. This was just him taking a subtle swipe at him. Then again, considering the level of skill Zack had just displayed, maybe he deserved to be a little arrogant. "Yeah," he said. "It's plenty." After talking about things for a while and exchanging information, both Zack and Zorian agreed that neither of them knew all that much about the time loop. Like Zorian had long suspected, Zack spent most of his time trying to think up a way to counter the invasion and had not put much thought into what the time loop actually was. According to him, he always thought he had to find a way to counter the invasion in order to end the time loop. He could not explain why he thought so, since his memories were full of unexplained holes, but he felt very sure about that. That could be a confirmation of Zorian's earlier theory that the release of the primordial was what triggered the restart, but it could also be a compulsion that Red Robe had put on Zack to screw him over. After all, the release of the primordial in the previous restart involved very visible cracks in space heralding its coming, something that Zorian had never witnessed before. And it wasn't like he had never observed the area around the hole during the last moments of previous restarts. Why had the release of the primordial never caused such dramatic symptoms in the past? Regardless, they both agreed that opening the Matriarch's memory packet was their best bet for getting some solid answers. Accordingly, over the course of the next week, most of their time was spent on tracking down and attacking various Iranian webs. They attacked a new one every single day, and the amount of experience in reading Iranian minds that Zorian had accumulated was incredible. Zorian probably read more Iranian minds in that 1 week alone than he had in the entire 2 previous restarts combined. The especially important part was that Zorian was no longer just reading the minds of random guards and patrol Arania, but also the minds of their leaders and even matriarchs. Not only were these higher-ranking Arania especially hard to read, and thus gave the most useful experience, their thoughts were also an entire order of magnitude harder to interpret. There seemed to be a method among Arania to turn their mental powers inward onto their own minds, and most higher-ranking Arania had at least some expertise in it. Zorian wasn't exactly sure what those techniques were designed to accomplish, but they altered the thoughts and perceptions of the user immensely. As a matriarch of a powerful web, Spear of Resolve was doubtlessly a user of these techniques as well. If Zorian had tried to interpret her memories without having taken this into account, he would have likely been in for a nasty surprise. On Monday, when classes began, Zorian visited Svim's office to try and bring him into awareness of the time loop again. In the previous restart, Svim had been very suspicious of him and his overtures hadn't gone anywhere. It was difficult to know how much that had to do with his approach and how much of it was a product of all the arrests in Scioria at the time, but Zorian was not taking any chances this time. He suspected he had tried to move a little too fast in the previous restarts, so this time he was more conservative. He waited until Svim was in his office before visiting him, tried to reduce his arguments to bare essentials and then finally handed him the code the man made him memorize. Svim still told him to come back on Friday in the end, but Zorian had a feeling things would end up working better this way. He was right. On Friday, Svim tentatively accepted his story and once again decided to help Zorian grow by honing his dimensional magic and shaping skills. For now he just tested Zorian's abilities to see where he stood, but he promised to have something more substantial for him next week. Considering how busy this restart promised to be, Zorian was perfectly fine with that kind of pace. The first week also reminded him how much more Kiriel focused on him when there was no Nachka around to distract her. Without a friend of similar age to spend most of her time with, Kiriel focused most of her attention on trying to monopolize Zorian's time as much as possible. He had almost forgotten how clingy and annoying she could be, and now resorted to building all kinds of magical toys for her to amuse herself with and leave him alone for a few minutes. Thankfully, she liked puzzles, and there were a lot of magical puzzles described in old spell formula books. Mages loved inventing them for some reason. Later in the week, when Kale and Kana moved into the house, some of that attention shifted onto Kana. In the restarts where Zorian introduced Kiriel to Nachka, Kana inevitably ended up as something of a third wheel to the two of them. They played with her, sure, but in any group of 3 people, someone was going to get pushed to the side, and Kana was much younger than Kiriel and Nachka, and silent to boot. He kind of suspected that Kana was happier with just Kiriel around. Since Kale was always informed of the time loop the moment he arrived at Amaya's house, and since Zack often visited the place to speak with Zorian, the two of them finally had the opportunity to meet and talk with one another. Although they did discuss the time loop a little, Kale had yet to fully absorb the content of his notebooks, that was getting harder and harder as the number of past restarts and the number of notes in them increased, so that didn't really get anywhere. Instead, they mostly talked about alchemy. And the weeping. Zorian would have thought they'd shy away from the topic, but apparently they were perfectly fine with bonding over their shared tragedies. Currently, both Zack and Zorian were sitting beneath a tree in the middle of nowhere, a small copse of trees surrounded by farmland in the vicinity of Jatnik, not really a notable area in any way. Zack was currently trying to make an unbroken crown of daisies, and failing hilariously, while Zorian stared at the map of Eldamar that had every web they had located marked on it. Thanks to the memories of various matriarchs and Iranian diplomats that Zorian had recently viewed, he now knew the locations of hundreds upon hundreds of new webs. Deciding where next to attack was actually quite a problem at this point. "Hey, Zorian," Zack suddenly said, discarding the daisy crown he was building in a huff after accidentally tearing it apart again. "I know you're on a time limit, but do you think we could take a few days to find a specific Iranian web?" Zorian gave him a curious look. Truthfully, he found their current pace very demanding and stressful, and would have probably begged for a break soon enough anyway. "I could, yes," he nodded, pointing at the map in front of him. "I won't say the map we have is really comprehensive or anything, but even if the web you're looking for isn't on it, it can probably point us in the right direction." "Yeah, that's why I'm bringing it up," Zack said. "I originally wanted to wait until you opened the Matriarch's package before mentioning this, but the more I think about it, the more I think we should check this out now. Maybe it will be crucial in understanding what the Matriarch was thinking." "What is it?" Zorian asked. "Spear of Resolve told me back then that if anything should happen to her, should go talk to the Ghost Serpent Acolyte's web," said Zack. "She refused to say where they are or how to reach them, though. That's why I have been visiting the Urania webs ever since then." Zorian frowned. Ghost Serpent Acolytes? The web that refused to speak to him because their spirit told them he was bad news? Could it be that they or their spirit knew something about the time loop? Well, the time loop did sever the link between the material plane and the spiritual ones, and the Ghost Serpent Acolytes worshiped some kind of snake spirit. Even if it was a native spirit, and thus lived in the material world, maybe it still had some kind of connection to the spirit planes and knew something important. "I know where they are," Zorian said. "There is no need to search for them. I can just tell you where they are." "Oh," Zack said. "Wow, and I spent so much time looking for them. I can't believe I could have just popped over to you and asked you where they live. We really should have met sooner than this, it seems." "Yeah," Zorian agreed. "Anyway, it's probably best if I just point you in the right direction and don't come with you. Every time I tried to talk to them in the past they said their spirit doesn't like me and that I should go away. It says I'm bad news." "That's weird," Zack frowned. "What did you do to piss it off?" "Nothing," Zorian said, shaking his head. I even tried visiting them soon after the restart began, before I ever interacted with any Arania. They react exactly the same way. I don't know what's up with that, but it's best if you go there alone and don't give them any indication we know each other. After listening to Zorian's directions, Zack immediately teleported away to meet with the ghost serpent acolytes, and Zorian himself returned home to wait for him and get some much-needed rest. However, it was only several hours later that Zack returned to Scioria as well and came over to Amaya's place to talk to him. He walked up to the table Zorian was sitting at and sat down next to him, an unreadable expression on his face. They wouldn't see me, Zack said. Their spirit says I'm bad news. Really? So we're both bad news, Zorian hummed, tapping his fingers against the table. Did they say why you're bad news? No, Zack shook his head. Do you think we should just attack them and read their memories? Zorian asked. He was all for being considerate, but it was obvious at this point that the ghost serpent acolytes held some important piece of the puzzle in regards to the time loop. No, Zack said quickly. If they know we're time travelers, perhaps they have some method of perceiving the restarts. Attacking them might forever sour their opinions of us. Maybe we try going there at the same time and refuse to leave until they agree to speak with us. Zorian arched an eyebrow at Zack. What? Zack defended himself. It's worth a try. Don't underestimate the effectiveness of being annoying for extended periods of time. In the end, Zorian agreed to go along with Zack's plan of annoying the ghost serpent acolytes into talking with them. He notified Kiriel and Amaya that he'd be gone from the house for a while and then left with Zack to visit the suspiciously judgmental web. The moment they approached the Iranian settlement, they were immediately ushered inside. Zack and Zorian gave each other an incredulous look and tried to ask their Iranian guides why they were admitted so readily when Zack was turned down earlier in the day as bad news. They were simply told that the ghost serpent wanted to see them and that they neither knew what was happening nor cared. They just did as they were told. Eventually they were led into a large circular cavern filled with water. There was a large rocky outcropping jutting from the center of this miniature underground lake, and a stone bridge connected the entrance to the cave to this rock. The ceiling of the cave was covered in small clumps of glowing white crystals, giving it an appearance reminiscent of the night sky full of stars, and the waters of the lake were dark and still. All in all, the cave gave off a very eerie feel to Zorian. Floating in the middle of this underground lake, just above the rocky outcropping, was a giant, milky white, translucent snake. The only spot of color present on the ghostly serpent were its eyes, which had a soft pink glow. Spirit names were often very fanciful and poetic, but it seemed that the ghost serpent was exactly what it advertised itself as. The moment he and Zack entered the cavern, the ghost serpent focused its large slitted eyes on them. A wave of pink light rippled across its ghostly scales, traveling out from its eyes and down to the very tip of its tail, and then it spoke. "Leave us, leave us, leave us," it said, its voice soft and melodious, not a trace of a hiss in the pronunciation. Why it felt the need to repeat the order 3 times was anyone's guess, since the Arania immediately began leaving the chamber after it had instructed them to leave. The ghost serpent waited for the Arania to leave and seal the entrance before it began to speak again. "How?" it demanded. "How can there be 2 of you? I know the rules well enough, only one can enter and only one can leave." "We don't know what you're talking about," Zack protested, folding his hands across his chest. "Why don't you start from the beginning, okay?" "You cannot order me," branded one. The ghost serpent snapped, coiling through the air angrily before fixing its glowing pink eyes at Zack again. "I hate you, hate you, hate you. Thief and murderer. Liar and egg smasher." "Hey, that's slander," Zack protested. "We don't even know each other. This is the first time we've met." "Is it? Is it really, really, really?" the ghost serpent asked with narrowed eyes, once again employing the unnecessary repetition in its words. "I wouldn't know, even if it is, would I? I know how this works. You both bear the brand. It glanced at Zorian for a second. That is the only reason I'm talking to you. I know the brand and I know what it means. Most have forgotten it, dormant as it has been in the past few cycles, but I am older than the mountains and rivers, and I remember. I remember the crimes they did, the way they made me fall. And if they behaved as they did at the end, who dares even imagine what they did in the in-between? But the branded ones are one and there are two of you. This makes no sense. Ghost Serpent, you must believe us when we say that we understand very little about what is happening, Zorian said. I have gathered from your words that you know about the time loop, yes? The time loop? Ghost Serpent repeated slowly, as if tasting the words. An interesting choice of words. But nobody remembers the in-between. Only the branded one. This is something that has happened again and again in the past. It is not difficult to understand. Then please shower us with your wisdom and explain it to us dumb people, Zack said, rolling his eyes. You're saying there have been more time loops in the past? Zorian asked hurriedly, before Zack had the chance to piss off the Ghost Serpent for good. Fortunately, it seemed that while the Ghost Serpent knew about the time loop, it did not actually retain the memories between restarts. It just knew that it was stuck in the time loop and could recognize them as time travelers due to their marker, which meant that this situation was possibly reproducible, and even if they bungled things up, it should still be possible to retry this conversation again. They were regular like the progression between night and day, Ghost Serpent replied. Every 400 years, whenever the planets aligned. But the gate has been lost for some time now, or perhaps the key. Alas, it seems someone has finally enacted this wretched thing again. May he burn in the molten heart of the world forever, ever. The Ghost Serpent writhed in the air for a moment, seemingly overcome with anger and outrage at the person responsible for the time loop. Then it focused on them both once again and spoke. I remember. Do you not? It asked. Do not answer, I can see it on your faces. I do not understand how the brand can be shared, but clearly it has happened. I do not wish to talk to you anymore. Please, O great spirit of this cavern, Zorian knelt, hoping that flattery and some humility may buy them some time. I can see you have been wronged grievously by the branded ones in the past. We do not dispute your grudge. But we have been thrust into the time loop unknowingly and without any say on our behalf. Flattery is good, but useless here, the Ghost Serpent said. I know how this works, you will come here again and again, sucking me dry of any knowledge and wisdom, learning of my fears and weaknesses, and you will take until there is nothing else. The only thing to do is not to engage you at all. What can you do to me, after all? Today I die, and tomorrow I live once more. We just want to know how this time loop works, Zorian said. Yes. Zack agreed. Just tell us what is happening here. If we are really the evil masterminds you imagine us being, then you'd be telling us something we already know anyway. Ghost Serpent hovered in the air silently for a while, considering the request. Very well, it said eventually. But after that, you must leave. And if you have any honor at all, you will never visit me again. Even after I have forgotten. We promise, Zack said easily. Zorian couldn't help but wonder if the boy really meant it. After all, the Ghost Serpent could be such a useful source of information. Promises are but wind, but they are better than nothing at all, Ghost Serpent said. Watch closely. The spirit shifted its gaze to the still waters around them, and a large sphere of water floated up in the air from the surface. After a few moments, the sphere flew over to where Zack and Zorian were standing and started writhing like it was about to burst. Instead it unfolded into a crude diagram, a single horizontal line with an upturned triangle balanced on top of it by the tip. The bottom link is the beginning and the end, the Ghost Serpent said. It is the world you were born in, and the world you will die in. The triangle is the world of in-between. It exists between the moments, constantly destroyed and recreated anew. A lifetime condensed in a moment. We are all trapped in this place, phantoms created for the branded ones like you to learn from and test themselves against. When the fires that fuel the world of in-between run out, we will all fade away into the void except for the branded one, who will go to the end, to live through this month one last time. Wait, are you saying this is all fake? Zack asked incredulously. That we're all some kind of illusion. A reproduction, not an illusion, Ghost Serpent replied. If you could mimic a painting in every stroke and shade, would it not be as real as the original from which it sprang? But that's Zack began to protest. Enough. Ghost Serpent snapped. I have given you what you asked for. Honor your end of the bargain and leave. Guards. Escort them out. And then, before either Zorian or Zack could protest further, the Ghost Serpent dived into the waters of the lake and disappeared from view. Despite its ghostly appearance, its dive caused a huge splash, forcing Zorian and Zack to quickly shield themselves or be thoroughly drenched. Okay, that was just rude. Regardless, the Arania soon came and politely, but firmly threw them out of the settlement. They both stood outside in silence for a while, lost in their own thoughts. So, Zack said. What do you think? I think that I need to open that memory packet as soon as possible, Zorian replied. The Ghost Serpent story had given Zorian a horrible suspicion about what Red Robe had been doing all this time. In the wake of their talk with the Ghost Serpent and their subsequent ejection from the Iranian settlement, Zack and Zorian teleported away to a sufficiently distant and remote location and sat down to discuss what to do next. And that's when the arguments began. Zorian really wanted for them to separate for a few hours. He needed some alone time to think about what they'd heard. To make sure his logic was solid. He had his suspicions already terrible suspicions, but they weren't the sort of thing he'd want to blurt out lightly. In fact, he wasn't sure he wanted to confide them at all to anyone. Even Zack. Another reason why he wanted a short break from his fellow time traveler. Zack didn't want to play along, though. We should talk about this now, Zack argued. While the memory is still fresh in both our minds. I have a really good memory, Zorian argued. Indeed, he had specifically memorized the entire meeting with the help of mind magic, and would never forget any of it. He could review the memory in vivid detail as many times as he wished. It would be better if I had a chance to think about the spirit's words for a while. Well, that's fine, Zack said, giving him a dismissive shrug. You can do that. Who's stopping you? But there's no reason why you can't do that here with me. I can be patient. I'll just quietly sit here by the side and wait until you're ready to talk. It will be like I'm not even here. Zorian gave him an annoyed look. He had serious doubts about Zack's ability to sit quietly like that for extended periods of time, and even if he could it wasn't the same. There was no way Zack didn't know that. Look, Zack said, matching his annoyed look with his own. I know how this goes. If I let you get away now, you'll use that time to think up some stupid story to throw me off with. You know something. I don't know anything for certain, Zorian protested, shaking his head. And frankly, if I wanted to keep my suspicions to myself, I wouldn't have bothered to invent some kind of elaborate lie to deceive you. I would have simply refused to tell you anything. Zack shifted uneasily for a moment. Okay, he said. I guess I was being a little unfair there. Sorry. But still, you aren't seriously considering just leaving me in the dark, are you? After I informed you of that stupid snake and helped out with your mind magic training? Surely you realize how fast that would kill any sort of trust between us. Zorian looked away. Of course he realized that. But it wasn't that simple. If what he was suspecting was correct, then how could there ever really be trust between them? There can only ever be one winner in this game, Spear of Resolve had said in her fragmented message. Only one can enter, and only one can leave, said the Ghost Serpent. If only one time traveler could keep the gains made in the time loop and the rest get dissolved into the void, like they had never existed at all, then how could they ever truly cooperate with one another? Any alliance would just be a temporary convenience, inevitably ending in betrayal. And when all was said and done, Zorian was pretty sure that Zack was in a much better position to screw him over than Zorian was to do the same. The time loop seemed to recognize Zack as more legitimate, if nothing else. Still, while a big part of him screamed at him to keep quiet about his theories at all costs, there was a small but equally insistent part of him that argued against keeping Zack in the dark. This situation seemed strangely familiar to him. After a while, Zorian realized what was bothering him. The idea of him hiding this sort of knowledge until he could be sure, and Zack being bitter at him for doing so, it reminded him so very much of his arguments with Spear of Resolve before she was soul-killed. And for good reason. He was pretty sure his current suspicions were exactly what she had tried to keep secret from him. He was thinking of treating Zack the same way he had been treated in the past. And he knew how much he had hated the matriarch's secretiveness back then. Did he really want to basically reenact the matriarch's secretive scheme, despite the catastrophic way it ended up resolving? Wouldn't it be better to treat Zack the same way he wanted to be treated? The trust had to start somewhere. Fine, Zorian sighed, turning back to face Zack again. I'll tell you. Finally, Zack shouted in exasperation, raising his hands in the air. I thought I'd have to hit you to make you come to your senses. Note to self, talk to Zack about his unfortunate tendency to resort to physical violence to solve personal disputes. Right now they had more pressing topics to discuss. I should note that this has the potential to really destroy any chance of us trusting each other, Zorian sighed. I mean, we already don't trust each other. You keep that mind blank spell up at all times when you're around me, for instance. That spell is harmful for your mind if you keep it up non-stop. I don't believe for a second that you don't know this. So you apply it specifically for our meetings because you're afraid I'll mess you up with my mind powers if I get the chance. Zack flinched, his face morphing into a comical expression of surprise. It reminded Zorian of that time he had caught Kiriel raiding the kitchen pantry for sweets a few years ago. You don't have to feel guilty, Zorian interrupted his response, shaking his head sadly. It's smart. I would have done the same in your place. But it helps illustrate my point: we already don't trust one another. How much more, then, would we be paranoid around each other if we knew only one of us could exit the time loop with their mind and magic intact? What? Zack asked incredulously. How? Why? The ghost serpent pretty much stated it outright: only one time traveler gets to leave the time loop, Zorian said. The rest disappear forever, I suppose. It makes sense. Really, I don't think there was ever supposed to be more than one time traveler. Or branded one, as the ghost serpent calls us. A reference to the marker, most likely. Anyway, if our situation is as unprecedented as the spirit suggested, and the time loop mechanism was only ever designed under the assumption dash. Zorian, Zack interrupted him. Don't take this the wrong way, but your explanations suck. I have no idea what you're talking about. Well, okay, I kind of do, but still. Start from the beginning, please. Fine, Zorian sighed, trying to squash his annoyance. The beginning. First of all, no time travel is technically happening here. No. Zack asked, frowning. How is that? The illusion world thing. There is no illusion, Zorian said, shaking his head. It's all real. We're real. Flesh and blood and soul and everything else. We're not living in a spell construct or some fancy dream. That's good, Zack said, breathing deeply. It would just kill me inside if it turned out that everything I've learned in here is fake and that I'll be the same old Zack I once was once I wake up in the real world. So what is this, then, an actual copy of the real world? Why not? Zorian asked. The gods have been known to copy people completely, duplicating them down to their souls and all. Plus, it seems that even mortal mages once knew how to conjure actual matter from nothing. Here, let me show you something. Zorian took out a piece of paper and some alteration tools out of his backpack and created a copy of one of Curiel's drawings in front of Zack, explaining how the spell functioned to the other time traveler. "That's a damn useful spell combination," Zack said. "I can't believe I never learned about it in all this time. This would have made so many things easier." "Yes, well, I can teach you how to cast the spells later," Zorian said. "Anyway, this is what I believe the time loop is essentially doing, albeit on a much greater scale. Whatever is behind this took a blueprint of the world, much in the same way I did with Kale's notebooks and my little sister's drawings. A mind-bogglingly detailed image of a single moment in time across the entire planet. Possibly beyond. And it is repeatedly producing a replica of the world based on that blueprint, allowing it to run for a month before destroying it and starting over." Zack stared at the drawing Zorian recreated, lost in thought. This particular one depicted two sparrows in the middle of fighting one another. It was pretty impressive how perfectly Curiel managed to capture this one moment of their battle in a static image. If only she was as dedicated in her magic studies as she was in her art. "That's crazy," Zack eventually stated. "And time travel isn't?" Zorian asked, raising his eyebrow. "I don't know, it somehow sounds more plausible to me than this," Zack said, sighing. He handed the drawing back to Zorian. "I guess it does make a lot of Ghost Serpent's ramblings make sense, though. But here is what doesn't make sense: if our original world is real, and this copy we're living in is also real, where are we exactly? An entire world takes up a lot of space, after all." "In a pocket dimension, I'm guessing," Zorian answered. "I have no proof, but hear me out. It is clear that, in order for this whole setup to work, we have to be under an insane amount of temporal acceleration right now. Otherwise, how could only a moment pass in the real world while we spend decades or even centuries in this looping world?" "Ah, I get it," Zack said. "It's not that the time doesn't pass in the real world while we're here, it's just that time flows so fast here that barely any time has passed in the real world." "Exactly," Zorian said. "But this sort of temporal acceleration is on a whole other level than even the best temporal acceleration facilities currently in existence." "Yes, so?" Zack shrugged. "Compared to copying the whole world, that seems pretty underwhelming." "I guess," Zorian agreed. "But I suspect there is more to it than just the creator of this thing being ridiculously powerful. Time acceleration rooms have to be isolated from the outside world in order to work with any sort of efficiency. But this isolation is still done through magical wards and physical obstacles like walls, which means there is only so much you can separate them from the rest of existence. A pocket dimension, on the other hand, only touches our reality in one particular spot, its anchor point. You can't get more isolated than that, and I bet the possible temporal acceleration is much bigger if you enclose the target area in its own pocket dimension." "So, you think the time loop is actually a physical copy of the world, enclosed in its very own, temporally accelerated pocket dimension," summarized Zack. "The time loop has a ridiculously detailed image of the real world as it was at the start of this month, and it periodically recreates the whole world based on that." "Yes," Zorian confirmed. "I'm only guessing all this, but it fits with what I found out so far." "And here I thought this thing couldn't possibly be any crazier," Zack complained, burying his face in his hands. After a second or two he straightened up again and looked at Zorian. "So how does this affect us? How is this different from this actually being a time loop?" "For one thing, it means that ensuring a perfect month is impossible," Zorian said. "You can't live through one loop, decide you really like how it turned out and then end the time loop and continue on from there. If you want to do things for real, you have to leave the time loop. You will then be flung back at the beginning of the month to try everything one last time." "Okay, that is an important difference," Zack admitted. "Secondly, the Sciorian Arania will almost certainly be alive and well in the real world," continued Zorian. "If everything here is a copy, and the pocket dimension is deliberately isolated from the real world as much as possible in order to facilitate temporal acceleration, then it's unlikely that anything done to people in the looping world affects their real-life counterparts. He could always soul kill them again in the real world, though, Zack pointed out, frowning. I doubt he can, Zorian said. I don't think the spell actually kills souls. I think it simply marks them in some way, letting the time loop mechanism know it should not recreate them at the beginning of the new restart. If the time loop is, as the ghost serpent believes, some kind of training mechanism, then it makes sense to include a function like that into it. It allows the branded one to get rid of impassable obstacles by removing them from the loop entirely. What? That's so unfair, Zack complained. Why does he get such an ability and I don't? You might have had it at some point, Zorian thought to himself. It's quite possible Red Robe got it from you and then wiped your memory of the spell. Do you think it might be possible to unmark them somehow? Zack asked. It's nice that the Urania aren't permanently gone, but it would be nice to have their help within the time loop too. I don't know, Zorian said. It depends on what exactly has been done to them. There is still another issue. Yes? Zack asked curiously. Considering what the time loop really is, I don't think we can just passively wait for the mechanism to run out of power, Zorian said. It seems likely to me that staying inside the looping world once it runs out of power equals permanent destruction. If we want to survive the collapse, we have to deliberately leave this place before it's too late. Which is a problem, since neither of us knows where the exit is or how to access it. Zack stared at him in shock. It seemed he hadn't really considered this possibility. And on top of that, the ghost serpent said only one person can exit this place, Zorian sighed. Meaning that the moment one of us leaves the looping world, all the other time travelers still inside are dead. Erased out of existence, really. We don't know this, Zack protested. How would the stupid snake know something like that anyway? You heard what it said. It has no memories of anything that happened during previous time loops. It could be making things up to divide us. It certainly hates the branded ones enough to try something like that. Still, what if the spirit is right? Zorian asked. What if only one of us can win this? Then neither of us leaves until we figure something out, said Zack immediately, straightening his posture. He gave Zorian a direct and determined look. We'll figure out a way to get both of us out alive and well. There must be a way. Though the boy was immune to Zorian's empathy due to his mind-blank spell, Zorian could still feel the passion behind his words. Zorian had to give it to him. Zack could be very inspiring when he wanted to be. Unfortunately, there was a very important detail he had forgotten. The thing is, Zorian noted quietly, it's not just the two of us who are here. Red Robe is in this world as well. Zack paused for a moment, not saying anything. Shit, he finally concluded. Yes, Zorian agreed. I think I know why we haven't seen any sign of him in all this time. You think he's trying to leave? Zack asked, fear creeping into his voice. It's what I'd do in his place, Zorian said. He thinks there is an unknown amount of other time travelers plotting against him, at least one of whom is a better mind mage than he is, and you have effectively slipped from his grasp. Why take the risk of confronting all that when he can just leave the looping world and erase all his enemies out of existence in the process? He's been in this place long enough that he's probably gotten most of what he wanted out of it, anyway. Damn it, Zack swore, kicking a nearby rock in frustration and beginning to pace around the place. Damn it. Why? Why is it always like this? I finally get some answers about this shit, and of course I'm 3 steps behind some asshole who is doing his best to screw me over. Zorian, please tell me you have some sort of idea where the exit is. This is just a wild guess, but I suspect it might be in the time magic research facility beneath Cyoria, Zorian said. Spear of Resolve was very insistent on making sure I learned its exact location, putting multiple redundant copies of that section of the map. There must be something important there. That's great, Zack said, brightening up. When can we go there? Zorian snorted derisively. Not for a long, long time. The place is insanely well secured. Even Quadakikl refused to attack the place without army support. Damn it, Zack swore. Of course it couldn't be that simple. I'm hoping that the Matriarch's memory packet contains some crucial information about the topic, Zorian noted. At the very least, it should tell me what about that place is so important. That way we can at least know whether or not to waste our time on the place. Well, that's something at least, Zack sighed. Hopefully we don't find the exit, only to see Red Robe just about to leave when we get there. Don't tempt fate, Zorian told him. Anyway, I just have to ask. Suppose we find the exit and Red Robe isn't there. I already told you. No one is getting left behind, Zack said, correctly guessing Zorian's question. Once we confirm where the exit is, we'll mess up Red Robe until he's no longer a problem, and then we sit down and figure out a way to get both of us out. And if we can't figure it out ourselves, we'll find someone who can. It's a big world out there, someone must know a way to help. Zorian stared at his fellow time traveler, a bit humbled by his optimism and sense of ethics. He kind of wished he could sense emotions off the boy, though, because he couldn't help but wonder if Zack was feeding him a bunch of idealistic rubbish while quietly planning to leave the time loop at the first opportunity. How much could he afford to trust the boy? And in the back of his head, a small, treacherous part of his mind whispered, how much could Zack afford to trust him? After that talk, Zack and Zorian threw themselves into Arania hunting with newfound fervor. Day after day, week after week, in all honesty, the different webs were already starting to blur together a little in Zorian's mind. But it was effective. His ability to interpret Iranian memories was growing by leaps and bounds, and he had even identified what the high-ranking Irania were doing with their own minds. They were manipulating their own thoughts, doing things like filtering distractions out of their senses, blunting inconvenient emotional highs and placing compulsions on their own behavior. It seemed to be a way to increase productivity and ensure better decision-making. It was also incredibly dangerous. Improperly done, this sort of mind magic could render one dead, catatonic, irreparably insane or worse, and it was a branch of magic that was easy to do incorrectly. Nobody truly understood their own mind, after all. Despite the danger, Zorian found the idea fascinating. It wasn't literally an intelligence boost, but it almost functioned like one. He would probably try to dabble in it at some point, but not now. He had his hands full at the moment. He just hoped that Spear of Resolve's mental manipulations weren't as radical and convoluted as some of the other Iranian elders he had seen recently. Zorian's lessons with Svim proceeded without incident. He decided not to tell the man about his latest findings about the nature of the time loop, as he still didn't know what to think about that himself, and was worried about how Svim would react to finding out he was just a copy. He was a remarkably calm and collected man, but that would be quite a revelation. He did, however, ask Svim about pocket dimensions. Unfortunately, Svim knew virtually nothing about them. The secrets of their creation were rare and closely guarded. Only the greatest of mages could make even a tiny one, and they did not share that knowledge lightly. Svim had claimed he had never seen one in his entire life, despite talking to a lot of capable mages, which made Zorian a bit amused. Technically, Svim was looking at a pocket dimension right now, he just didn't recognize it as such. Between his interaction with Zack, Orania hunting and lessons with Svim, Zorian was constantly busy. It was tiring, and he opted not to do many of his usual routines from previous restarts. He never went to hunt monsters with Taven, for instance, and never told her about the time loop either. Finally, as the end of the restart began to approach, Zorian decided he had prepared as much as he could. He informed Zack he would try opening the Matriarch's memory packet soon and that he was taking a 2-day break from Arania hunting to get some rest before the attempt. Kyrielle, at least, was ecstatic about that. She could finally have him all to herself for 2 whole days, or at least that's how she seemed to interpret his decision, anyway. It was currently the second day of his self-imposed rest, and he was lying on his bed, reading a rather silly piece of fiction dealing with time travel. It was a book about a man who went 3 years back into the past to prevent a devastating war and save his lost love. The story was more amusing than Zorian thought it would be when he started reading it, but that was probably just him. The story was supposed to be a romance, not a comedy. It's just that he personally couldn't take it very seriously. The time travel spell was powered by love. Of all things, what kind of magic was that? Kiriel interrupted his fun by jumping on top of his bed, and elbowing herself in by his side, where she pretended to read the book with him for a while. "Can I ask you something?" she suddenly asked after a while. "Go ahead," Zorian said, turning the page. Kiriel quickly stopped him and turned the page back where it was. Maybe she actually was reading along. "Do you always bring me along when you go to Syoria?" she asked. "Oh. That question again." "No, not always," Zorian admitted. "Why?" she asked immediately, outrage creeping into her voice. He could tell she kind of expected that answer, but definitely didn't like it. "Because it's dangerous," Zorian admitted. "Zack isn't the only time traveler beside me. There is a third person looping, and he is after us. Truthfully, the sensible thing would have been to never bring you along. No. Kiriel protested. "But I'm just too damn nice to do such a thing," Zorian finished. "Mom says that praising yourself is in poor taste," Kiriel informed him. Zorian gave her an annoyed look and promptly dropped the open book on her face. She sputtered indignantly for a moment before lifting the book and trying to use it as a bludgeon against him. She gave up quickly when she realized it wasn't very effective. And when she noticed Zorian was trying to distract her from her questions. "Why don't you call the Mage Guild on this guy if he's so dangerous?" she asked. "Because he's a time traveler and they would be of no help," Zorian said, rolling his eyes. "I doubt I could even get them to believe me. And even if I could, it would just be a huge clue for the jerk as to where he can find me." "That sucks," Kiriel declared. "Yup," Zorian agreed. She fidgeted nervously for a moment, setting the book down beside her on the bed. "Am I of no help?" she asked. "You help keep me sane," Zorian told her. "That's it. I totally defended you from Zack back at the train station," she pointed out huffily. "Okay, you definitely have a point there," Zorian admitted. Even if he hadn't been in any real danger, Kiriel's actions were still glorious. "But really, what are you getting upset about? Are you afraid if I don't bring you along every single restart, I'll get bored of you or something?" "Yes," she admitted. "Daimen and Fortov both went to the academy, got themselves new friends and forgot all about us. Then you went there as well, but couldn't get any friends, and I know it's kind of mean, but I was glad for that because that meant you didn't forget about me. Kiri," Zorian sighed. She ignored him and continued with her explanation, quickly spilling out word after word and barely pausing for breath, as if it was all going to disappear if she stopped. "But you were still getting so distant and you were always annoyed at everything. And then you bring me along and you're suddenly nice, but now you suddenly have this Zack who is a time traveler like you and he will remember and I won't and Kiri, there is no way Zack can replace you," sighed Zorian, hugging her to stop her from getting herself even more upset, and rolling his eyes at her when she could no longer see him. She got worked up over the dumbest things sometimes. "The guy is almost as annoying as you are, and he doesn't even have an excuse of being 9 years old." She proceeded to hit him in the back for that comment. Well, at least she wasn't crying. "I'll forgive you for not bringing me with you sometimes," Kiriel eventually decided. Very generous of her. "But you're not allowed to forget me." "Sure," he agreed easily. What kind of request was that anyway? But the more he really thought about it, the more he realized he might not have a choice in the matter. If Red Robe decided to leave the time loop and collapse this entire world behind him, what would the future have in store for him and Kiriel? The real Zorian and Kiriel, that is, since the Curiel he was looking at was just a copy, same as he was. And that was another thing. He was just a copy of the real Zorian. If he found a way to return into the real world, what was going to happen to the original? Ugh, he was getting a headache just thinking about it. He'd kind of have preferred it if the time loop simply switched his soul with that of the original. That would mean he was killing the original Zorian by exiting the time loop, but this looping world had effectively killed hundreds of such Zorians already, so what difference would one more make? Would the original Zorian agree with such assessment? Would he accept that it was okay for him to die so that a future version of him might live? In all honesty, probably not, but there was no way that would stop him from performing the switch if he had to. Tomorrow he was going to finally open the Matriarch's memory packet. He really hoped it had the final pieces he needed to figure out this puzzle once and for all. "Alright," said Kale, handing him a vial full of glowing yellow liquid. Inspecting it closely, Zorian could see that the glow was not uniform, but instead came from tiny glowing motes swimming inside the liquid. "This is the potion I was talking about. The potion of self-awareness. It's meant to improve a person's ability to block out distractions and focus inwards. It's typically used to help train people's ability to sense their mana reserves and souls, but I suspect it will be helpful for this type of mind magic as well." "How reliable is your information about this stuff?" asked Zorian suspiciously, swirling the liquid inside the container. "Did you test it somehow or?" "This is what my teacher used to help train my abilities," Kale said. "It definitely works for its intended purpose. And while I'm not entirely sure it will help you in your task, it definitely won't hurt to take it. Zack volunteered to test the potion a few times, so I know for a fact it doesn't interfere with mind magic." He pointed towards the boy in question and Zack promptly gave Zorian a thumbs up and a bright smile. "Ugh. The jerk refuses to drop his mind blank around him for any reason, but he blithely drinks a bunch of strange potions made by a junior necromancer he just met. Sometimes he just didn't get that guy. Fine. Here goes," said Zorian, quickly downing the liquid. Almost instantly, Zorian's mind sharpened to an incredible degree while, paradoxically, the outside world began to feel distant and indistinct. It wasn't that his senses suddenly grew worse, because they were as sharp as they ever were, but what they were telling him suddenly became a lot harder to focus on. He stopped struggling against the effect and let his mind turn inward. He could sense his heartbeat, his muscles shifting as he fidgeted in place, the blood coursing through his veins. He could sense his mana reserves and the way they reacted when he tugged at them. His personal soul sense, normally so faint and sluggish to respond, suddenly seemed much easier to understand. Damn. Why hadn't he asked Kale for something like this earlier? This would have been incredibly useful back when he was trying to develop a personal soul sense. No, he couldn't get distracted. He discarded these visions and instead dived into his own mind where the Matriarch's memory packet stood. He did not feel the same sense of increased clarity this time, probably because his mind magic was already too good for the potion to improve, but that was okay. He mentally grasped the decaying memory packet and began to carefully take it apart. Not carefully enough, it turned out. The packet, already on the verge of falling apart completely when he began, couldn't tolerate Zorian's still somewhat inexperienced touch. It violently burst apart, momentarily dazing Zorian with a burst of confusing images, some kind of defense mechanism, maybe, and the memories contained within began to rapidly fade away from his mind. Swearing internally at his failure, Zorian scrambled to access some of the memories before they all faded away. Previously, Zorian had been hoping that Spear of Resolve hadn't delved as deeply into the mental self-manipulation as some of the other Iranian elders had. Now he could safely say he was an optimistic fool. The memories currently floating in his mind spoke of an absolute master in the field that made all the other expert Iranians look like total underachievers in comparison. Spear of Resolve seemed to have found a way to turn part of her mind into a magical calculator, could somehow temporarily separate her mind into multiple parallel threads of thought, and could integrate perceptions of multiple Iranians into a unified, coherent whole. And that was just the stuff he could figure out in the short time he had been given. Even if Zorian had been given several extra years to get better at reading Iranian memories, he doubted it would have helped him interpret the memories locked inside the memory packet. And yet, despite all of this, there was one particular memory that Zorian could easily understand because it had been made understandable specifically for him. If you are reviewing this memory, the Matriarch's memory echo said, then in all likelihood, our plans were foiled and things went awry. It also means you have gotten good enough at mind magic to dive into the memory packet and read some of my memories. Well done. I hope you have had the courtesy of respecting my privacy and leaving the rest of my memories alone. Zorian could literally feel the smugness in her words. As in, she had made sure to attach that particular emotional impression to that particular section of the message. She knew damn well he had no hope of interpreting the rest of her memories. Even in death, that spider was mocking him. I know. You think I had it coming by rushing into this, but hear me out. I have sought out every clue about the time loop I could find. Most of what I'm about to tell you comes from the patron spirit of another Iranian web, the Ghost Serpent Acolytes. Seek it out if you haven't already, though be warned that the spirit might not be too happy to see you. What an understatement. Did the matriarch not realize the depth of the ghost serpent's hatred of time travelers, or did she simply think her warning was sufficiently informative? Other sources include the researchers at the Time Magic Research Facility beneath Scioria. You can find its location in the map I've attached inside this message, as well as some of the invaders that had the chance to interact with our mysterious time-traveling foe. It seems the invaders were quite curious about their new informant and have invested considerable time and effort into figuring him out. Damn. His investigation into invaders never seemed to produce any results as far as Red Robe was concerned. Then again, by the time Zorian was able to investigate them properly, Red Robe was no longer interacting with them at all. What I have gathered from all this is that this time loop is some kind of fake, parallel world. We're real, but we're not. It's hard to understand. Or maybe accept. The problem that arises from this is very simple: the time loop is degrading. I can't tell how long it will be before it collapses entirely, but I do know that simply waiting for it to end would be disastrous. One has to deliberately leave this place. And everything I've gathered about our time-traveling foe from the invaders suggests he is completely unconcerned with finding the exit or leaving. I do not believe for a second that our foe is too stupid to see the importance of this or too complacent to make it his priority. The obvious conclusion is that he has already found the exit, and he can leave at any time. Thus, stopping him was of utmost importance. No matter what, he couldn't be allowed to leave the time loop. Oh, this was bad. And also, if I am honest with myself, the ghostly memory of the matriarch hesitated, as if wondering whether to say the next part at all. If I am honest with myself, I had been hoping that I could find out how our mutual foe joined the time loop. So I could join it as well and then, eventually, leave it before anyone else could. Wait, what? I'm not heartless, mind you. I would have done everything in my power to help the alternate version of you on the other side. Zack too, for that matter. But I had essentially been planning to betray you. The amount of good I could do for my web, for my species, and yes, maybe even for myself, it's so very irresistible. I hope if you ever get out of this place, you will not blame my other self for my own weaknesses, but I simply cannot see how I can make any other choice. It's nothing personal, but there can only ever be one winner in this game. I am truly sorry. That Zorian almost tore the entire message apart in anger after listening to that. All this time he had been feeling guilty about her dying, hoping that Red Robe was lying and there was some way to bring them back, and it turns out Spear of Resolve was planning to screw him over. But no. No, he wouldn't be destroying the message. It was important. Too important for him to throw it away. He would listen to the message to the very end. He owed Spear of Resolve that much, at least. Even if she tried to betray him. I am unsure if this message is even necessary. But if the time loop can so casually create copies of us, it can surely destroy us just as easily. Our foe clearly has deep knowledge of how the time loop works. Thus, this message. I hope it won't be necessary, but just in case, I put in a map to point you towards the invaders' bases and more importantly the time magic research facility deep beneath Scioria. I am rather sure the time loop exit is located there. It is an ancient artifact called the Sovereign Gate. You can find its legend in various books easily enough, I'm sure. The security is high, but you will find a way to access the facility peacefully at the end of this message. The gate did not react to me no matter what I did, but maybe it will to a proper time traveler like yourself. Otherwise, you may have to find the key to get it to open. This is bad, since if I have interpreted the ghost serpent's ramblings correctly, the key consists of the 5 imperial treasures of the first Icosian emperor. The ring, the crown, the staff, the orb and the dagger. These items are all lost, likely scattered across Mycena. You'd have to conduct your search on a whole other continent. I didn't think it was possible, even with the help of something like working Bakura gates, so I didn't put too much effort into tracking down rumors surrounding them. After that was a map of Scioria's underworld, largely identical to the one he already had but with the various holes in his version filled out with relevant information. Finally, the matriarch gave him information on the government inspector that had the authorization to access the time magic research facility, to check up on their work and make sure they weren't wasting government funding. According to the matriarch, the man was not even a mage, and was easy to impersonate, which was how she had gotten access to the place. Aside from the prearranged message, he did not get anything else out of the memory packet. But truthfully, the message was already a little too much for him. The matriarch's plans to betray him, the fact that Red Robe might have figured out a way to leave a long time ago, the stuff about the key in the end. Eventually the effects of the potion wore off and he found himself drawn to the world around him again. Both Zack and Kale were eager to see what he learned from the packet, and Zorian did his best to tell them about his findings. All except for the way Spear of Resolve planned to betray him. That felt a little too personal at the moment. The unanimous conclusion was that they had to access this time magic research facility as soon as possible. Accordingly, Zorian would raid the government inspector's place the very next day to steal his identity badges and everything else they needed to gain access to the place. 2 days later, everything was ready. Since it would be a bit implausible for government inspectors to consist of 2 teenagers, Zack had bought them both a shape-shifting potion on the black market that turned them into nondescript, middle-aged men. Which was weird. Regardless, with their appearances changed and with all the necessary documentation in their hands, they simply walked into the appropriate city office and demanded access to the facility. Zorian had been worried that Spear of Resolve had been insanely lucky on her own try and that somebody was going to call their supposed superiors to confirm their orders and identity, but no such things happened. They weren't even suspicious about the fact that there were 2 of them when there should have been just 1. Zack, being an idiot, actually asked them about this. Zorian was about to wipe their memories and shout at him, but it turned out they saw nothing wrong with his question. Awful security. You must be new, the guy talking to them said. That place gets inspected constantly. The royals are afraid someone is going to steal their precious sovereign gate, so they check up on it constantly. That's why there's so much security around the place. Honestly, I don't understand why the researchers tolerate it. If I was in their shoes, I'd send the damn thing back to the royal treasury so I can work in peace. I bet it isn't even the real thing. After that, they were directed to a fancy magical elevator on the edge of the hole, which took them down to the facility in question. Along the way, they passed next to the various other, less secretive research facilities. One of the armed guards that rode along with them was talkative and wouldn't shut up about them. Zack actually engaged the man in conversation, which was nice, because it allowed him to stay silent without looking too rude. The other guard was as silent as Zorian. The 2 of them shared a friendly eye roll with each other in regards to the 2 gossips next to them and then ignored each other for the entire ride. Finally they reached the place, passing through 2 more armed checkpoints that merely glanced at their papers before shooing them inside, and then they were finally inside. They were greeted by a pair of researchers, one middle-aged, and one that couldn't be more than 18 years old in Zorian's estimation. They offered to give them both a tour of the place, and were quite surprised when they accepted the offer. "We don't often get inspectors that are actually interested in our work," the middle-aged man commented. He had introduced himself as Cranton Keklos earlier. "Most just want to see the Sovereign Gate to see it's still there and intact, and then leave as soon as possible." "Oh, we definitely want to see the Sovereign Gate as well," Zach said, smiling. "We just thought it might be interesting to see what else you have got down here." "Of course," Cranton said. "Rest assured that we have been taking good care of it. We're grateful to the Crown for allowing us to study such an amazing artifact." "You don't believe it's a fake like everyone else seems to?" asked Zorian curiously. "I'm not sure if it's the Sovereign Gate of historical legend," Cranton admitted. "But it is surely a genuine artifact from the Age of Gods." Over the next hour, Cranton and Ariad, his younger assistant who mostly let Cranton take the lead, led Zach and Zorian through the facility to demonstrate their work. Zorian could tell that Cranton was absolutely ecstatic to give someone he considered influential a tour of the place, despite his subdued attitude. He wanted more funds and support from the Crown, and thought that pandering to them might help him get it. There were three main portions of the facility. The first was a series of 3 black rooms. The first and smallest was reserved for experiments on plants and animals, while the 2 bigger ones saw human use. The second portion dealt with combining alchemy and temporal acceleration in various ways. Finally, the third and last part was based around a large black cube about 4 meters long on each side. There was a door-like depression on the side of the cube, but Cranton explained that they had never managed to get it open. Carved into this door was a very familiar geometric diagram, a horizontal line with an upturned triangle balanced on top of it. "There it is," Cranton said, sweeping his hand towards the black cube. "The Sovereign Gate. Despite the legend surrounding it, we believe it is some kind of powerful time acceleration room rather than a literal gate to another world. Sadly, we have never really managed to activate it. I had high hopes that the upcoming planetary alignment and the resulting amplification of dimensional magic might be the key to getting it to work, but no such luck. Shame." "Amazing," Zach said, staring at the cube with an unreadable expression on his face. "Yes," Cranton agreed. "It's hard to believe something like this had just been gathering dust in the Novita family treasury for countless decades. If it weren't for Mr. Zveri's generosity in donating some of Novita's unneeded artifacts to the Crown, who knows how long it would have languished there undiscovered." "Yes," Zach said frostily, grinding his teeth. "What a generous guy, that Tezin." "Well," Cranton coughed, realizing he had struck some kind of nerve, "although I'm happy to answer any questions you may have, this is about it for what we do here. If you would dash." Zorian looked around to confirm they were alone in the area for the moment and then reached out to the 2 researchers' minds. Though both Cranton and Ariad were highly trained mages, they were specialists in time magic and had no real mental defenses. In just a few seconds, Zorian forced their minds into mindless stupor. They remained standing on their feet and looked fine at first glance, but they were effectively unconscious. Zach raised an eyebrow at their sudden silence. "You got them?" he asked, turning to Zorian. "Yes," Zorian confirmed. "So, do you know how we can activate this thing? And is it even wise to do so? I mean dash." "We should try touching it," said Zach. "Yeah, okay." It wasn't like Zorian had any better idea. "We should do it together, though," Zorian remarked. "Oh, right, that way we will hopefully both activate it at the same time. We both have the same marker thing, so it should work, right?" "Right," Zorian agreed uneasily. He wasn't so sure personally, but what else he could do? If the matriarch was right, Red Robe already knew about this place and could leave whenever he wished. The time loop still existed, though, so clearly he didn't. Why not? Zorian would have in his place. He needed the answers the thing held. On three, said Zorian. 1, 2, 3. The both pressed their palm against the diagram on the door in perfect synchronization with each other. 2 seconds passed. Nothing is happening, Zack complained. Damn. No, Zorian frowned. He could feel something reaching out from the cube in front of them, trying to access his marker. Asking for confirmation. I could feel something. I don't know if you can feel your own marker yet. Not really, no, Zack said. Well, anyway, I think if I just . He flipped one of the switches on his marker. The mysterious force reaching out from the cube immediately rushed into him. Everything went black. Zorian half expected to wake up in Siren again, with Kiriel jumping on top of him and wishing him a good morning. But he didn't. He was instead floating in a black, featureless void. And Zack was right beside him. Whoa. What happened? Zack asked, looking around. Where are we? The cube wanted me to give it confirmation of some sort, said Zorian. So I said yes. And here we are. If we're permanently stuck in this void because of you, I'll never forgive you, Zack warned him. You would have done the exact same thing in my place and you know it, Zorian said. Well yeah, but aren't you supposed to be the paranoid, sensible one? Agreeing to unknown requests from a mysterious ancient artifact sounds pretty stupid to me. Before Zorian could say anything, another person popped into existence in front of them. No, not a person. The entity in front of them was vaguely human-like, but that was clearly just a crude Ade. It wore no clothes, but that was okay because it had no genitals, body hair or anything else other than smooth skin. Its face was blank and apathetic, and its eyes were glowing white voids devoid of iris or anything else except soft light spilling out of them. Welcome, controller, the entity said, its voice soft and emotionless. Zack reacted faster than him. He immediately reached for his spell rod, only to find it effectively glued to its holster. Checking himself, Zorian noticed his own spell rods suffered similar fates. In fact, his very clothes seemed to be glued onto his skin, and though he could feel his mana reserves, he didn't seem able to manifest any of that mana at all. Who are you? Zack demanded. What is this place? I am the guardian of the threshold, the entity said, as apathetic as its face. And this is the control room. I don't think this is a physical place, Zorian noted. Notice how your clothes seem to be a part of your body. Hey, you're right, Zack said, frowning as he tried to roll up his sleeves and failed. We're some kind of projections, Zorian said. As is the entity in front of us. They both stared at the entity in front of them. It seemed to interpret their attention as some kind of prompt. What is your request, controller? The guardian asked. Can we leave this place? Zorian asked. Of course, the guardian agreed easily. Do you want to do that now? By leave, we mean go back to the bodies we're being projected from, Zack clarified. The answer remains the same, the guardian easily responded. What about leaving the time loop? Zorian asked. Time loop, the guardian mouthed uncomprehendingly. Its eyes flashed for a moment before it refocused on them again. I'm sorry, but the gate is barred. What? Zack protested. What the hell do you mean, the gate is barred? The controller has already left the time loop, the guardian explained. It's not possible for anyone else to leave. There was a brief silence as Zack and Zorian processed this claim. But I thought we were the controller, Zack protested. You are the controller, the guardian agreed easily. But you just said the controller has left the time loop, Zorian frowned. He has, the guardian confirmed. Why is the time loop still in existence, then? Zorian asked. The time loop cannot end while the controller is still inside the time loop, the guardian said. So the controller has left the time loop, but you can't end the time loop because the controller is still in the time loop? Zack asked incredulously. Don't you realize how stupid that sounds? I don't think we're dealing with a sapient being, Zorian said. It's some kind of animated spell performing its function and getting confused that there are multiple controllers when there is only ever supposed to exist one. Guardian, how many people are you talking with right now? Only the controller can access this place, the Guardian placidly answered. So wait, Zack said in a trembling voice. You're saying Red Robe has somehow tricked the control room into thinking he's the controller of the loop, Zorian sighed. He has already left. And so no one else can leave. The gate is barred, the Guardian confirmed. For nearly half a minute, the endless void they floated in was silent. Neither Zack nor Zorian knew what to say, and the Guardian of the Threshold seemed content to placidly wait for further questions. Zorian would have liked to say he was considering the implications of this new knowledge at the time, but the truth is that he spent most of it being surprised at how well Zack was taking all this. He kind of expected the other boy to freak out and start swearing and shouting by now. But no, Zack was surprisingly calm and quiet about the situation. The only evidence he was in any way upset was a slight frown on his face. So, Zack eventually said, his voice cutting through the unnerving silence that sprung up around them. What now? I honestly don't know, Zorian admitted. I really didn't think Red Robe had already left the time loop. It makes so much sense, though, now that I look back on things. Yeah, he really screwed us over, didn't he? Zack sighed. Well, I wouldn't exactly put it like that, Zorian smiled. I'm pretty sure this is not what he had been planning. We were meant to disappear. The time loop was supposed to collapse when the controller of the time loop left this place, permanently removing us as a threat. But we're still here, and if the time loop is this out of its normal parameters, it might actually be possible to get out of this place. Heh, Zack chuckled. Now that you mention it, yeah. And also, this means I can stop holding back. You too, for that matter. We've both been doing our best to keep a low profile to stop Red Robe from noticing our activities. Now that we know he is no longer here. Yes, Zorian agreed. The way I see it, we have three main priorities. Number 1, we need to find out how long we have until the time loop collapses. Number 2, we need to find a way to get out. And number 3, we have to try and find out who the hell Red Robe really is so that we can take care of him quickly if when we exit this place. Zorian turned to the side to look at the Guardian of the Threshold, who had been quietly floating in place not far from them while they talked. It didn't appear bothered by them ignoring it. We should question the Guardian about everything we can think of, Zorian noted. Who knows what kind of critical secrets it knows, and it doesn't appear as if it cares to share anything on its own initiative. Though that could take a while. We should probably return to our bodies for a while to make sure we aren't interrupted. Do we even have to worry about that? Zack asked, pulling on his jacket in order to demonstrate the way their clothes seemed an integral part of their body. The cube seems to have ripped our souls out of our bodies to bring us here. Does it even matter if our bodies get killed out there? We could be just projected here, Zorian shook his head. It sounds like the simplest way to achieve this, to be honest. Then again, that would leave the loop controller awfully vulnerable while messing around with controls. Guardian. You are merely projected into this place, but your stay will not be cut short by events in the outside world, the Guardian explained. It was apparently smart enough to interpret what his question was likely going to be based on his and Zack's conversation. Interesting. If your physical forms suffer critical damage, or if soul tampering is detected, I will draw in your souls inside the gate for safekeeping. Your time here will remain uninhibited, though you will have to start a new iteration of the loop in order to leave the place, as I cannot re-anchor your souls back to your bodies if they are not sufficiently intact. Well. Good to know, I guess, Zorian mumbled. He looked at Zack, and found that the other boy was already staring at him. Do you have anything you want to ask the Guardian or? You go first, Zack told him, shaking his head. All right. First of all, is there a time limit as to how long we can remain here? Zorian asked. When this iteration of the loop ends, so will your current visit to this place, the Guardian responded. Other than that, no. So when the time loop restarts, they will be flung back to their bodies at the beginning of the month, but other than that, they could stay here as long as possible. They had plenty of time, then. What are the criteria for each iteration's end? Zorian asked curiously. Is mere passage of time sufficient, or is there more to it? Passage of time is sufficient, the Guardian confirmed. No iteration is allowed to last for more than a month at the time. Beyond that, there is a multitude of contingencies that will cause the iteration to terminate prematurely. Can you list those contingencies? Zorian asked. No, the Guardian stated emotionlessly. You aren't authorized for that information. Zorian blinked in surprise. Though he had suspected the Guardian wouldn't be able to answer all of their questions, he thought it would have to do more with it being just a dumb animation spell in the end, not that it would literally refuse to help them like that. What? But I thought we're the controller, Zack piped in suddenly. How can we not be authorized to know? The controller doesn't have unrestricted authorization, the Guardian explained. Only the Maker and his agents have access to information about the workings of the gate. Maker? Zack repeated incredulously. Maker of what? Of the gate, of course, the Guardian said. Zorian could almost imagine the Guardian rolling his eyes at the question, even though its eyes didn't work like that and its voice never changed in tone. So the controller isn't the ultimate authority when it comes to the gate or the time loop? Zorian asked. The Guardian immediately confirmed this. What can you tell us about this Maker, then? You aren't authorized to know the identity of the Maker, the Guardian informed him. Of course it was going to be something like that. Ugh. This thing is so damn annoying. Zack complained. 10 more fruitless minutes were spent on trying to question the Guardian about the Maker, its agents, whether it was a god, like Zorian suspected, or not, how long it had been since the Maker had last interacted with the gate, and so on. The Guardian's response was the same for each of them, they weren't allowed to know. Zorian wished he could just invade the thing's mind and be done with it, but their inability to perform magic in this place extended to his psychic abilities. They had no way to force the entity into cooperation, and eventually decided to move on to other topics. You said no iteration is allowed to last for more than a month, Zorian reminded the Guardian. Can you tell us why? When an iteration is over, everything in it is destroyed, the Guardian began. Well, good to have that confirmed. Zorian had assumed it was so for a while now, but having the Guardian verify it was nice. Under certain philosophical outlooks, this could be viewed as mass murder. But not under all of them, huh? Zorian mumbled distastefully. Others do not view destruction of copies as a problem, so long as they do not diverge excessively from the original, the Guardian continued, ignoring Zorian's interjection. The time loop is set up under such an assumption. Thus, it is imperative that entities copied by the time loop are not given enough time to meaningfully diverge from the originals, as their destruction would then become unethical. A month was determined to be a good cutoff point. What if one of the copies managed to achieve awareness of the time loop and found a way to maintain continuity across different iterations? Zorian asked. Hypothetically speaking. That would be very unfortunate for the copy, the Guardian noted. Only the controller can actually leave the time loop, after all. See, this is the part one don't get, Zack suddenly interjected. Why was such a rule put into place? I mean, there is only one controller to begin with, so why put that sort of limitation in place? To stop the controller from trying to smuggle some of the copies out of the time loop, the Guardian said matter-of-factly, as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. There was a short pause as both Zack and Zorian processed this. Why is that important? Zorian asked shakily. Because only the controller has their real soul pulled into the time loop, the Guardian said. Everyone else is a copy. For a controller of the loop to leave, I only have to re-anchor their soul back to their original body. For one of the copies to enter the real world, I would have to switch their soul with the soul of the original. This would effectively kill the original. There was another, longer pause following this explanation. Zorian wasn't terribly surprised at the fact that him leaving the loop would require he switch his soul with his original. It was one of the first ideas he came up with himself, after all. What surprised him was that Zack was apparently not a copy. Being the controller had more to it than just having a marker stamped on your soul, it seemed. So the controller has their original soul drawn into the time loop when it is first made, Zorian said. They aren't a copy, so there is no problem with them leaving. But everyone else would have to kill someone to get out, and that's unacceptable. Is that correct? Yes, the Guardian agreed. But you could do that? Zack suddenly spoke up. If one of the copies wanted to leave this place, you could switch their soul with that of the original. Theoretically, the Guardian admitted, but that goes against what I was made to do. I am the Guardian of the Threshold. One of the main tasks the Maker gave me was to ensure things inside the time loop could not menace the source of the template. If a diverged copy tried to kill the original by switching their souls with it, I would do my best to stop them. What about a normal, undiverged copy? Asked Zorian. Surely there is no harm in replacing the original with a normal copy. They're practically the same thing. It's what makes it okay to destroy millions of souls every month or so, isn't it? The Guardian hesitated. A short, tense silence descended on the scene as it considered the scenario. So long as the copies do not diverge too much from the original, such a switch would be theoretically acceptable, the Guardian eventually admitted. But it is my purpose to keep the time loop from spilling out in the real world as much as possible, so I would still refuse to perform such a switch. Only the controller, with the knowledge and secrets they gathered inside the time loop, is allowed to leave and make their mark on the world outside, since they are technically of that world to begin with. Alright, Zorian nodded, signaling Zack with his hand to drop the issue. Though still very placid, the Guardian seemed almost agitated by their current line of questioning. Zorian was afraid that if they pushed it too much it might realize one of them was a copy somehow and do something to correct this. Best to leave the topic alone for now. Let's move on to something else. Guardian, you said the gate is barred because the controller has already left the time loop. Yes, the entity confirmed. Can you tell me how many iterations that was ago? Zorian asked. The controller is still inside the time loop, controller, the Guardian said unhelpfully. Some more variations of that question confirmed that the Guardian had no idea when Red Robe left. The controller left, but didn't actually leave, and the Guardian was hopelessly confused about the whole thing. Asking the Guardian for Red Robe's description or other identifying information didn't work either. The Guardian didn't seem to perceive the world in the same way they did, despite its fairly human-like appearance and the lifelike avatars he and Zack were inhabiting. It seemed to ignore just about everything in terms of identifying characteristics when it come to the controller. Other than the marker, of course. So the controller that left has the marker, then? Zorian asked. Of course, the Guardian confirmed. How could he have left, otherwise? How does the controller get the marker in the first place? Zorian asked. Is it hereditary, assigned by the gate itself according to some criteria or what? The controller is marked by the key, by the Maker, or by its agents, the Guardian said. I am not aware of what criteria were used in choosing any particular controller. It is ultimately irrelevant to my purpose to know such things. But the key is lost, Zack said, frowning. Scattered across vast distances. And if the Maker is a god like you suspect he is, well, the gods have been silent for centuries. That only leaves his agents. Who would that be? Impossible to say for now, Zorian shrugged. But apparently you were purposely chosen by someone to go in here. Or maybe Red Robe was, Zack said gloomily. I know you think I'm the original looper, but the fact that Red Robe was capable of leaving just like that, it could be that he's the one who's the real deal. You saw how the Guardian reacted to the possibility of switching souls between the copy and the original. How did Red Robe leave if he's just a copy? I don't know, Zorian sighed. It's too bad the Guardian gets all stupid whenever anything involving Red Robe leaving is brought up. If it didn't get all stupid about it, we would have probably been erased out of existence when Red Robe left, Zack told him. So that's probably a blessing in disguise. Anyway, Guardian. This marker I have on me is unique, yes. There is no way for there to be multiple controller markers. None, the Guardian confirmed. Before the time loop is activated, marking a new person will invalidate the old marker. Inside the time loop, the controller marker cannot be invoked, and only lesser markers can be placed. Lesser markers? What the hell are those now? Zack protested. The controller can temporarily add people to the time loop by placing a lesser marker on them, the Guardian explained. What? Zack squawked. There is a way to include someone in the time loop and you're only mentioning this now. And what do you mean temporary? Though I'm happy to answer any question you may have to the best of my ability, I am ultimately not designed to teach the controller how to operate the time loop, the Guardian said. That is the job of whoever placed the marker on you. And by temporary, I mean that the target of the lesser marker will retain their memories and abilities for up to 6 iterations before the marker dissolves. Why would this lesser marker be temporary like that? Zack asked, baffled. Is there a way to make it permanent? It is temporary to keep divergence from the original to a manageable level and discourage the controller from getting excessively emotionally attached to copies marked in such a fashion, the Guardian explained. There is no way to make it permanent, as that would be needlessly cruel. They cannot leave the time loop, after all. But if copies that retain awareness for more than a month count as people and killing them is wrong, doesn't that mean that using these lesser markers is effectively murder? Yes, the Guardian readily agreed. But it is not the gate that does it, so it is acceptable. It is up to the controller to decide when and if they feel comfortable using such an ability. So, Zorian began after a short pause. I would never have used such a spell, Zack immediately said, correctly guessing what Zorian was about to ask. Never. Why would I torture myself by bringing people into the loop, knowing that they would suddenly go back to their old, ignorant self in just 6 restarts? Fair enough, Zorian said, guessing he had touched upon a sensitive topic. Guardian, what about the ability to expel people from the time loop? Make them start each iteration soulless and dead. Does this ability exist? The controller has such an ability as well, the Guardian confirmed. By now, Zorian knew better than to ask whether such an ability had been used in the past. The Guardian had very limited awareness about what happened in the time loop itself, caring for little except the controller itself. How about the ability to restore people erased in such a manner back, he asked instead. He was still angry at the matriarch for planning to betray him, but he wanted her back anyway. No, the Guardian said. The ability instructs the gate to make changes to the base template that is used to construct each iteration. There is no undoing them without direct intervention from the maker. The controller is advised to use this ability with wisdom and restraint. For the next 20 minutes, Zack and Zorian tried to question the Guardian about the manner in which these abilities could be performed by the controller or about any other abilities they may have at their disposal. Sadly, neither of those inquiries achieved results. The Guardian did not know how any of these abilities might be accomplished, and it refused to list all the abilities the controller had, saying they were not authorized to know that information. This makes no sense, Zack complained. It's happy to tell us about specific abilities if we ask, but a simple list of all options is forbidden. Well, it sort of makes sense if the maker didn't want every controller to know about all the features at their disposal, mused Zorian. If some or all of the controllers are given limited information, you don't want to let the Guardian tell them all about it anyway. Another fruitless question and answer session occurred, where Zorian tried to ask the Guardian about the history of the time loop and its purpose. The Guardian claimed not to have any knowledge of previous time loops, though, beyond simply knowing they existed. Apparently it did not retain its memories between different time loops. As for the purpose of the time loop. The purpose of the time loop is between the controller and the one who marked them, the Guardian concluded. Or perhaps it would be more accurate to say it is whatever the controller wants it to be. There is little to stop them from doing whatever they want while inside the time loop, after all. Alright, next question, then, Zorian sighed. Can you tell me how long will it be before the time loop runs out of whatever is powering it and shuts down? That is to say, how long do we have to leave this place? Yes, of course. The time loop has enough power for 52 more iterations before it must shut down, the Guardian said. Assuming maximum utilization of each iteration, that is equivalent to little more than 4 years of operation. For years maybe he was just greedy, but that seemed very short to him. He asked the Guardian about that just to see what it would say. He expected it to refuse to answer, bringing up their lack of sufficient authorization or whatever, but the Guardian actually had an answer for them this time. The time loop is normally supposed to be initiated at the peak of planetary alignment, the Guardian explained. Unfortunately, something seems to have gone wrong and the time loop has been activated 1 month prior to it. This made everything more costly, causing the time loop to degrade far more rapidly than it is supposed to. Do you know how long the time loop had been in existence thus far? Zorian asked. 967 iterations, the Guardian answered. Approximately 30 years in linear time. Wait, those numbers were kind of strange. How could almost 1,000 iterations equal 30 measly years? Wait, frowned Zorian. So the time loop spends power per iteration, not according to how much time passes. Yes, the Guardian confirmed. But I cut a lot of restarts short by dying to some stupid shit in the first few days, Zack protested. Are you telling me I've been burning through our allotted time every time I did that? Yes, the Guardian confirmed again blandly. It is the controller's right to do such a thing, however. Presumably you felt the gains were worth the sacrifice of additional time. Hell no, I didn't. Zack protested. I just didn't know any better. If I knew all this, I would have been a lot more cautious about this shit. Unfortunate, the Guardian said. It did not sound very sorry or compassionate, however, using the same pleasantly bland voice it always did. It seems you were poorly prepared for this undertaking. You should complain to whoever gave you the marker once you get outside. Yeah, I'll get right on that. Just as soon as I manage to find the bastard, Zack said gloomily, so anyway, let's just get this finally out of the way. Guardian, how can we unbar the gate? You would have to present me with the key by bringing it before the gate, the Guardian said simply. If you present all 5 pieces, you will gain sufficient authorization to reopen the gate. I don't suppose you could tell us where to find those things, then? Zack tried. No, the Guardian immediately answered. Of course. But finding them should not be too difficult for you. Your marker can sense their presence. Not for the first time, Zorian wished the damn marker stamped on his soul came with an instruction manual or something. Though they continued to question the Guardian for 2 more hours, very little new information came out of it. When they finally decided to leave, the Guardian informed them that they would have to start a new iteration of the time loop because their bodies had been excessively damaged, while they talked to the Guardian and the dumb thing didn't find it important to mention that until they were ready to leave. After about 5 minutes, when Zorian realized Zack was not going to stop ranting at the Guardian any time soon, he just reached into his soul and flipped the marker restart switch. Everything went mercifully dark and silent. Like always, Zorian's awakening was done via Kiriel jumping on top of him. The events immediately following the awakening were also fairly typical, with him having his talk with Ilsa and dodging Mother's attempts at conversation while having breakfast. He even ended up inviting Kiriel to come with him to Scioria, despite initially planning to leave her behind. Partially, This was because he realized his vague plans of rushing to gather the key as soon as possible and find a way to fool the guardian into letting him out were rather premature, and he should really take some time to calm down and digest things a little. But an equally important reason for it was that he realized he needed a break. The previous restart had been very exhausting, what with all the non-stop Arania hunting and the various revelations at the end, and he didn't feel like jumping into another long-term mission right away. Taking a restart or two to relax a little and think things through wasn't going to kill them. The time limit they had was uncomfortably short for his tastes, but not that short. He was just wondering how to explain all this to Zack when they next meet each other when he was interrupted by the knock on the door. What? That doesn't usually happen. He went to open the door, reaching out with his mind sense towards the unknown visitor, only to find Zack on the doorstep. Apparently his fellow time traveler wasn't content to wait for him on Sayoria's train station. Zorian was kind of shocked, and not just by the fact Zack decided to come to his home. He could actually sense Zack's mind now. It was still shielded, but the boy wasn't under the effect of mind blank anymore. Zorian was kind of touched at the show of trust this represented. "Hello, Zack," Zorian said. "Fancy seeing you here." "Yeah, well, our last meeting's ending was a little abrupt," Zack told him with a little glare. "So I thought I should drop by and finish our conversation." "Sorry," Zorian winced. "I know ending things so suddenly was a jerk move, but I was already kind of depressed from what the Guardian was saying, and you getting into a one-sided shouting match with the thing was." "It's fine," Zack said, waving him away. "I lost my nerves too. It's probably for the best you shut me down before I did something stupid. That thing seemed pretty uncaring, but if anyone can manage to piss off a non-sapient spell construct, it's me." "Zorian, who is that?" Mother suddenly said, walking up to them. Turning around, Zorian could also see Kiriel peering from behind the kitchen door as well, watching the situation unfold. "It's just Zack," Zorian said. "He's one of my classmates from Sayoria." "Oh my, Zorian finally has friends visiting him at home," Mother noted in exaggerated mirth. "I never thought I'd see the day. Could I get an introduction?" "Sure," Zorian agreed. "It was only polite." "Mother, this is Zack Novita, a friend and a classmate." "Zack, this is Sikin Kaczynski, my mother. The little girl peering from behind the door is my little sister, Kiriel." Mother gave Kiriel an annoyed glare and gestured her to come over and introduce herself properly. Huffing slightly at the order, Kiriel approached and shook hands with Zack as proper manners dictated. "What, no Fortov?" Zack asked with a whisper. Mother always had good hearing, though, so she ended up hearing anyway. "He's at his friend's place right now. He'll meet us at the train station, so you can see him there. I assume you intend to take a train to Sayoria along with Zorian, yes?" "Yes. The train." "Of course," Zack fumbled, giving Zorian a questioning glance. He had probably expected them to just excuse themselves and teleport to Sayoria. "I decided to take Kiriel with me to Sayoria this time," Zorian said. "I hope you don't mind her traveling with us." Kiriel gave Zack the hardest look she could muster, daring him to disagree with her coming along. Right. "Of course I'm okay with that," said Zack. What followed was about 20 minutes of Mother trying to talk Zack into accepting something to drink and fishing for information about him. Zack decided not to mention he was the last living heir of a noble house, possibly because he still remembered what Zorian had told him about his mother, and simply described himself as a wealthy orphan from Sayoria. Based on the looks Mother gave him, however, Zorian was pretty sure she suspected the truth. She was quite perceptive about these sorts of things. Eventually, the four of them packed up and left towards Siren's train station. "How come Zack doesn't have any luggage to carry along?" Kiriel protested, glaring at the bag of her own things that Mother had forced her to carry herself. "Well, I'm from Sayoria to begin with," Zack said with a grin. "My luggage is already there." "Unfair," she mumbled. "Oh, you'll see unfair when we get to Syoria, Zorian told her. There's an hour walk from the train station to where we'll be staying, and I heard it's going to rain too. When they finally reached the train station, they found Fortov already there, talking to his friends. Mother insisted on introducing Zack to him, which annoyed Zorian far more than it probably should have. No offense, Zorian, but your family seems pretty nice to me thus far, Zack told him later, when he finally managed to excuse himself from Fortov's group. Maybe I'm a little biased, since my family all died and I wish I actually had a family, but I honestly can't figure out your animosity for them. It's personal, Zorian told him in a clipped tone. There's a lot of history that you aren't aware of. Just drop it. Fine, whatever, Zack sighed. I don't want to start a fight. I actually want to apologize. Zorian gave him a strange look. Apologize? Zorian asked curiously. What for? Well, you mentioned last time how I keep up a mind blank around you at all times and how it means I don't trust you. You don't have to apologize for that, Zorian told him, shaking his head. I also told you I would have done the same in your place, remember? No offense, but I don't want to be like you, Zorian, Zack said, shaking his head. Well, screw you too, Zack. The feeling was mutual. The point is, you were right. We don't trust each other, and we're not going to get anywhere if we have that constantly hanging over our heads. We need to work together if we want to have any chance of getting out of here. Well, that wasn't quite what he said, but since Zorian actually agreed with the sentiment, he didn't interrupt. So anyway, I think you already noticed I'm not under the effect of mind blank, Zack said. Of course, Zorian nodded. I do notice your mind is still shielded, though. Well yeah, Zack said, rolling his eyes. Trust your neighbors but lock your door, you know. I wasn't complaining, Zorian said. I was just going to notice the shield doesn't feel like a spell. That's a non-structured mental defense, yes. Of course you already tested it, Zack sighed. Goddamn mind readers. But yes, it's non-structured. I got it a long time ago, back in the first decade of my looping. It's kind of rough for something you've been practicing for decades, Zorian admitted. I mean, I know it's hard to practice non-structured mind magic when you aren't psychic like me, but I've seen other regular mages with similar defenses and theirs were a lot better than this. I never really refined it much since, well, I never needed it for anything more complex than resisting casual mind reading and the like, Zack said. This isn't just me being lazy, mind you. This is pretty much conventional wisdom about non-structured mental defenses among mages. Or at least that's what the various magic instructors I learned from told me. Get just enough skill in the ability to foil casual attacks and deal with anything more severe with proper defensive wards and the like. If you don't have time to set up those, locate the source of the mental attack and go on the offensive. Or just outright flee from the scene. Most mages agree that fancy non-structured mental defenses are more trouble than they're worth. Well, I'm kind of biased, but I don't agree, Zorian said. Yes, I feel a bit stupid now for just accepting conventional wisdom when it comes to that, Zack admitted. I've been stuck in a time loop for decades, it's not like I didn't have the time. I've honed far more useless skills to perfection just for bragging rights, so I really shouldn't have skimped out on something like this. But enough of that. I have a request for you. Go ahead, Zorian nodded, motioning him to continue. Don't mess with my mind without my express permission, Zack said. Even if you catch me without any mental protection or something. Well, okay, Zorian agreed. I can respect that. What if I suspect you to be under the influence of another mind mage already, though? I have to think about that, Zack fumbled. For now, no. Don't mess with my mind even then. Just knock me out and wait for the effect to wear off. Zorian wanted to point out that some mind effects didn't wear off, but he could see that Zack was still very uncomfortable around mind magic and decided to postpone this talk for some other time. Alright. I'll leave your mind alone. I will only use my mind sense and empathy on you, since they require no mental invasion to use and it's almost impossible for me to not use them on someone. Anything else? Yeah, Zack said. The fact you can sense and manipulate the marker placed on us and I can't really burns, you know. I can accept you're a better mind mage than I'll ever be since it's your special ability and all, but this personal soul sense of yours is something I could have easily acquired myself if I knew about it. Do you think you can teach me how to do that? I think I'll have to set you up with one of my teachers to do that, Zorian frowned. Alanik has access to potions I have never even encountered elsewhere and knowledge of how to help if something goes horribly wrong. I don't think it's going to be too much of a problem, though he's a pretty helpful person, despite initial appearances. Eventually the train arrived and they were forced to cut their conversation a little short. Since they were going to share a compartment with Curiel for the rest of the ride, any sensitive conversations would have to wait for a while. Even if they had wanted to talk about something arcane, though, Curiel wouldn't have let them. Any apprehension she felt towards Zack melted away during the first 20 minutes of the train ride and the resulting boredom. She started asking Zack questions about Scioria and the academy. Later on, Zack would remark how surprised he was at the way Curiel treated him, as Curiel had been rather more unfriendly towards him in the previous restart. But, as Zorian explained to him, that Curiel was one who had a far worse impression of Zack and that bad first impression of Zack had never really left her for the rest of the restart. The way Curiel was treating him now was actually far closer to her true personality than what he experienced before. Kind of strange that you don't like most of your family, but you're so close to your little sister, Zack remarked. Was it always like that, or? I always did like her best out of all of them, Zorian said. But no, I did not have this good of a relationship with her before the time loop. There was a reason why I had never brought her along before I started retaining my awareness across restarts. Ah. I figured it was something like that, Zack said. So do we have a plan for this restart or what? I was hoping we could take a break for a restart or two, Zorian sighed. I need to think about things and come to terms with all of this. It's a lot to take in. Fine, Zack said eventually. I guess we should spend some time getting to know each other anyway. You can still introduce me to that Alanik fellow that teaches personal soul sensing, right? Absolutely, Zorian confirmed. You can work on your soul sense while we decide what to do. It's not like I intend to literally do nothing myself, you know. Oh. What do you have in mind for yourself? Zack asked. I've been pursuing lessons from my mentor, Svim, but I could never really properly focus on them thus far. Now that I don't have the decaying memory packet in my head demanding most of my attention, I figure I should finally be able to give him all my attention and see what the results are. I'm still not sure how much to really tell him about the time loop and how it functions, though. I mean, I'm freaked out by how it works, and I'm actually aware of the restarts. I'm not sure it's a good idea to explain to Svim what's really going on. I can't help you there, Zack shook his head. I never had much luck in convincing people about the time loop, and that was before I knew all this crazy stuff about it that I do now. I have no idea how you even convinced Svim to take you seriously about time travel, considering he never believed me when I tried to do the same. You went to Svim to try and tell him about the time loop? Zorian asked. I guess you really meant it when you said you went to just about everyone with the story. Yeah, Zack agreed. Do you think it might help you convince him you're telling the truth if I came with you? I can do some pretty crazy magic on demand, by now. I don't know, Zorian said. I didn't mention you when I talked to him previously, but that was mostly to minimize any links between the two of us in case Red Robe somehow caught wind of Svim's investigation in the time loop. Now that we know Red Robe is gone, it might be a good idea to include you into the story. Zorian considered things for a few seconds. I'll go alone on Monday, Zorian decided. But I'll tell him you're also a time traveler and see if he wants to meet you. Of course Svim wanted to meet him. Frankly, if Zorian was in Svim's place and a student came to him with a story about being a time traveler and then another student was also a time traveler, he'd react the same way too. Thus, the very next day after Zorian's talk with Svim, he returned to the man's office with Zack in tow. "So, Mr. Novita," Svim began. "Mr. Kaczynski here claims you and he are stuck in a time loop, and have lived through this month many times before. You've lived longer than him, apparently. I've already heard Mr. Kaczynski's story and saw the evidence he had for it, and now I'm curious to hear your side of it. But before we get to that, I admit I'm curious about your level of skill. Do you mind if we take an hour or two to test your magical abilities?" "Sure," Zack shrugged. "I guess we're going to have to leave the office for that, though." "That won't be necessary, Mr. Novita," Svim told him. "The test will consist of simple shaping exercises." "Shaping exercises?" Zack asked, surprised. Kind of underwhelming, but okay. "Ready when you are." "Oh dear. Should Zorian warn him?" "No. No, it would be more amusing this way." "Levitate this pen, please," Svim told Zack, handing him one of the many pens strewn along his desk. "And then make it spin in the air." Zack smiled, doing just that with total ease. At which point a marble nailed him straight in his forehead, causing him to lose concentration and stop levitating the pen, never mind spinning it. "What?" Zack asked incredulously. "You failed," Svim informed him, finger tapping against the table impatiently. "But you threw a marble at me," Zack protested. "And you immediately lost concentration," Svim said with a long sigh. "Shameful. And you're supposed to be someone who trained magic for literally decades. What could you have possibly been doing all this time? Zorian here would have never let some little thing like that distract him, and he has only been stuck in the time loop for a few years." There was a long pause as Zack looked incredulously between Svim and Zorian, as if unable to believe what he was hearing. Zorian was struggling not to laugh. He could kind of understand why Svim had done this. It was an asshole move, and completely inappropriate for a teacher, but damn if it wasn't amusing. "Well, I suppose it's to be expected," Svim said. "Decades of shoddy instruction is nonetheless shoddy instruction. One more promising student failed by the poor state of our magical education. Let's try that again, only properly this time. Start over." "I hate this guy," Zack told him as they left Svim's office. "I don't think I've ever wanted to strangle someone more in my entire life." "Yeah, Svim has that kind of effect on people," Zorian agreed. "I mean, I knew he was an asshole, but I never quite realized he was that much of an asshole. You know." Yes, he knew. Oh, how Zorian knew. If he's always like that, then why the hell did you keep coming back to him restart after restart? Zack asked incredulously. "I wanted to prove him wrong," Zorian shrugged. "He was an ass, but he was demanding excellence in something I'd always felt I was good at, and so I just couldn't let it go. Besides, he's not utterly terrible, once you get to know him a little." "Not utterly terrible," Zack repeated, rolling his eyes. "I really hope this is the end of it and I never have to talk to the guy again." "You know, Svim is pretty good at non-structured mental defenses," Zorian said innocently. "No," Zack said immediately. "What?" Zorian grinned. "I was just going to suggest you ask him for help in mastering the ability. I'm sure he'd be happy to help you train." "No. Absolutely not," Zack shook his head. "And don't think I didn't notice how much you were enjoying yourself while I suffered in there. I'll find a way to pay you back somehow, you'll see." Rather than be intimidated by the threat, Zorian finally laughed.